Alright. Okay. You're right. Okay. You're right. Okay, wait, actually, I want to change what this says. We're here. We're here. Oh, hey, Spruce Lass. How's it going? Excuse me, why can't I change this right now? Music playing. Please let me select it. It's not giving me the little dongle that lets me type in what the thing says. Okay, wait. Can I add a second one? No, it's not opening up the little box either. Good but unmedicated today. Well, I'm glad you're doing good while being unmedicated. And if you require to be medicated, I hope you get medicated again soon. Or not. But either way, wishing you a good day. Blimey, alright. Please, I want to listen to the Fall of Civilizations podcast, but I want to credit them on screen. Ugh. Okay, what if I hit settings? Oh, I could literally just hit settings and it puts up another text box. Fall of civilizations. Easter Island. Yeah, I spelled that right. Okay. Oh, oh no. Oh. Okay. There's a lot of construction outside, so, I mean, we're going to be mostly listening to the podcast today anyway, just because I don't feel like talking too much today. But if you hear any in the background, it's they're doing something. The power is out at my school. I gotta do Zoom school now because of the storm. No! Well, I'm glad you're getting storms. I mean, I guess that's kind of sucky because snow gets in the way or wet gets in the way, but currently all the stuff I need is within a 5-minute walk of where I live, and it's completely desolate in Toronto. It's just bare concrete out here. And so I'm desperately jealous of anybody who has any kind of storm system moving in. What? There's Stinky Treen. Hello. Good. Oh, good for you. Get those pills. Excellent. Does that like stack? Like, does that actually like half the time it'll take to get what to your goals, or is it like, I don't know. I'm just imagining like if you just took like a whole handful of HRT, if you just immediately got like huge jubblies, I don't really know how it works. Fascinating though. Buzzing off your hair. Oh, yo, I did that the other day. Here, you know what? Check out. It's such a bad haircut. Let me see if I can pull it up. I was actually debating putting on the video before. I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not putting pants on. Let's see. Ooh, it's so chunky. It'll fill in. And I mean, this webcam has like a wide angle lens, so it makes my big forehead look even bigger, but I took that all off, because fuck having hair. Not to do that, okay. Okay, I kind of suspected. Yeah! Feels good to have it all off. Enjoy having no hair. Or less hair. I've been consistently like freaking out everybody at the pool because like, okay, maybe this is like the main character syndrome, but I swear to God, every time I take off my pool cap in the pool to do my last couple of like cool down laps, everybody like does a double take because they don't expect me to have such short hair. And again, maybe it's main character syndrome, but every time I cut my hair, I always get like the are they a girl or are they a boy reactions to in like customer service and in plainclothes. Less of a problem or less of a thing when I'm wearing a women's bikini or a women's swimsuit, but I can see the mental calculation going on, especially in like Toronto, where everybody's like a little bit more aware of weird gender fun stuff. They're like, "Sir, ma'am, sir," and I'm like, "No, ma'am's fine, but whatever." I'm just making it more confusing for these poor people. I'm like cis as hell, but hate having hair touch my ears. It's the tism, you see. Ah, yes. I hate having to touch my forehead. Like, I kind of like the looks of bangs. I'm cute in bangs, but it's just, I feel it, and I'm like, it's depositing grease on my forehead. I don't like it. Get it off. Shit's wild. Okay. Let's get started. I'm going to get my, no, I do want that up. I'm going to get my podcast going, and we are going to do a evil, dangerous, stinky train today. This is all, but yeah. All right, let's get my podcast going. What did I say? Easter Island? Yeah. Rome and Britain, Bronze Age. Power off. Mysterious. I just charged it. Okay, it's going up. You guys let me know if it's loud enough. In a second, they're doing a thing where they bring you in with the sound of gulls in a beach.
In the early 18th century, a Dutch explorer named Admiral Jacob
Dutch!
Roggeveen was sailing across the vast blue expanse of the South Pacific Ocean. He had been on the sea for 17 days, searching the Southern Ocean for a mythical continent known as Terra Australis. And when he saw a small island on the horizon, his heart must have skipped a beat, as Roggeveen recounts in his diary.
There was a great rejoicing among the people, and everyone hoped that this low land might prove to be a foretoken of the unknown southern continent.
But as their ships approached, it became clear that this was no vast continent, only a small island, a dot of land in the middle of the ocean. Nevertheless, Roggeveen was curious, and he ordered his 3 ships to prepare for landing. It was Easter Day, 1722. As the Dutch got closer, it became clear that the island ahead of them was inhabited. They saw smoke rising from the villages along the coast, but it was a seemingly barren land.
We originally, from a further distance, considered Easter Island to be sandy. The reasons for that is that we counted as sand the withered grass, hay, or other scorched and burnt vegetation, because its wasted appearance could give no other impression than of a singular poverty and barrenness.
As they sailed closer, the island's inhabitants came out on canoes to meet them, greeting them with friendly astonishment. This was much like other islands that Roggeveen had visited before, but when he got ashore, what he found on this island amazed him. Along the beaches, lined up in rows with their backs to the sea, was a line of stone statues. They were carved from black volcanic stone, some of them standing 10 meters high, wearing crowns of red sandstone. But Roggeveen and his men couldn't understand how these statues had got there.
The stone images at first caused us to be struck with astonishment, because we couldn't comprehend how it was possible that these people, who were devoid of heavy, thick timber for making any machines, as well as strong ropes, nevertheless had been able to erect such images which were fully 30 feet high and thick in proportion.
Roggeveen and his men didn't stay long.
30 feet high,
They
thick
soon
in proportion,
set sail
ideal woman.
away from the island and on across the Pacific. But the remarkable image stayed with them.
Hi,
And they must have asked
House flipper.
themselves,
Oh!
how did those people
I can't wait to fucking dive into not only House Flipper, but also that 6.5 hour Germa super edit of his House Flipper streams. Ugh. I love House Flipper. I love Germa.
Construct so many vast stone statues when so little building material seemed available to them?
So
Why
based.
had they built so many? And if such an advanced civilization had once lived on this island, where on earth had it vanished to? My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory, and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time, who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode, I want to tell the story of one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles, the mystery of Easter Island. I want to explore why it's not actually much of a mystery at all. I want to examine how this unique community grew up in complete isolation, how it survived the tests of centuries against overwhelming odds, and I want to take you through the evidence about what happened to finally bring this society and its enormous statues crashing down. The Pacific Ocean is the largest and deepest of Earth's oceans. At over 165 million square kilometers, it covers 1/3 of the Earth's total surface. It's so vast that if you were to look at Earth from outer space, it's just about possible to position yourself so that only the Pacific Ocean is visible, and you could imagine that you were looking at a planet completely composed of water. But the Pacific is not an unbroken
Hell yeah,
sea.
lurking.
Across its blue expanse, there are over 25,000 islands of varying size, many of them thrown up by
Oh,
volcanic
thank you.
eruptions that burst from the lively tectonics
Sometimes I put my own
of
work
the
as
Pacific
my
plate.
background.
Easter Island is at the eastern corner of an
The
area
Urker.
we call the Polynesian Triangle, a vast region of the Pacific Ocean broken by over 1,000 volcanic islands. And Easter Island itself is a loosely triangular shape too, made up of 3 extinct volcanoes at each of its points. The largest of these volcanoes is called Terravaka. It's a young volcano, bursting out of the sea less than 400,000 years ago, its lava gushing out and raising a peak that looms half a kilometer
Hot.
above the ocean. When it first erupted, Terravaka's lava pooled so that it joined up 2 older volcanoes on either side of it, and the landmass that today we call Easter Island was born. I'll put a map up on Twitter and Patreon for you to see its geography for yourself. The people who have lived on Easter Island for centuries call it by the name Tepito Ote Henua, which translates literally to the center of the world. Other names for it are translated as the land's end or fragment of the earth, and today's Polynesians call the island Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui is a small island, only about 24 kilometers end to end and 12 kilometers wide, and it's one of the most remote and isolated places on Earth. From the coast of Easter Island, it would take 3,200 kilometers to reach the nearest continent of South America,
I could swim
about
that.
the distance from Paris to Damascus, and even the nearest inhabited island is over 2,000 kilometers away. The Polynesians who first settled the island arrived from the west. Sometime before the year 3000 BC, they had left the mainland of the Asian continent, and since that time, these hardy sailors had perfected their craft until they were the most successful ocean-going settlers in history. They built large, sturdy canoes with 2 hulls. In fact, effectively 2 canoes joined by a deck and with 2 masts with sails. The catamaran design of these ships was incredibly sophisticated, and in fact they look like a modern sailing boat used for racing. They were both stable and fast, and they allowed the Polynesians to gradually settle the entire Pacific Ocean. These early settlers navigated the oceans without any physical navigation devices. They knew the stars well enough that they could make astonishing calculations about latitude and longitude using only the night sky. And they didn't write this detailed knowledge down, but used only songs and stories to memorize the properties and positions of the stars, islands, and known sea routes. The Polynesians also used the natural world as an aid to their navigation. They followed the flight paths of seabirds like the black tern, and this ancient Polynesian sailor's song shows the significance of these birds.
The black tern is my bird in whom my eyes are gifted with unbounded vision.
These epic voyages were all the more impressive because the winds in the South Pacific blow westwards, against the direction of the Polynesians' expansion. To travel these vast distances against the winds, the explorers developed a sailing technique known as tacking, where the craft zigzags against a prevailing wind in order to catch some forward motion. And storms in the Pacific could be deadly to these early explorers. It's been recorded that when a severe typhoon struck, these sailors had a method of surviving that seems unthinkable to a modern sailor. They would actually purposefully flood the hulls of their canoes, and because the wooden hulls provided enough flotation, the ship would stay afloat. But with most of its body submerged, it would survive being buffeted about in the gale-force winds. While the storm went on, the sailors would climb inside their flooded hulls,
Yeah,
keeping
just
their heads
ugh.
above water.
Let it be
and
like a
wait
nice
for the winds
periwinkle
to
blue or
pass.
something like that. Let that be the default wall color.
There has long been a debate about when exactly these intrepid Polynesian adventurers arrived on Easter Island. It was long assumed that they had arrived sometime in the 4th or 5th centuries, but studies of the islanders' language and radiocarbon dating recently revised that estimate to somewhere around the 8th century, and even more modern analysis has pushed that date forward even further. Many scientists today believe that Rapa Nui wasn't settled until sometime around the year 1200 AD. At this time around the world, the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan were finalizing their conquest of northern China. The notorious Fourth Crusade, headed for Jerusalem, instead sacked and burned the Christian capital of Constantinople. An exotic import from Arabia, called sugar, was mentioned for the first time in an English text. And on the other side of the world, in the middle of the vast expanse of the Pacific, a small band of Polynesian sailors landed their boats on the shores of a new land. An ancient piece of Rapa Nui folklore credits the settlement of the island to a Polynesian king called Hotu Matua.
In Hiva, Haumaka had a dream in which his spirit travelled to a far country, looking for a new home for his king, Hotu. His spirit arrived at 3 small islands, and another was
A
larger
little
one
Genghis
with a
Khan.
crater on the
Oh,
southwest
hey.
corner. The island was the 8th or
Thank you,
last
Strong
island
Garnet. You have a good rest of your day, my
twilight
friend.
of The rising sun. The
Stinky
spirit
Tree's back.
travelled counterclockwise around the island, leaving 28 places, including Anakena, a landing place on the north coast of the island and future residence of the king. When Haumaka awoke, he told his brother Huatava about the dream. After hearing about the dream, Hotumatua ordered Haumaka to send some young men to explore the island. Hotumatua told his 2 sons to build a canoe and search for the island of Haumaka's dream. So the 7 men left in a canoe, stocked with yams, sweet potatoes, bananas, and other foods. They left on the 25th day of April and arrived on the 1st day of June, a voyage of 5 weeks.
These settlers brought everything that was required for the traditional
Possums are so good. They're
Polynesian
like the
lifestyle.
ideal shape.
They brought their
Perfection.
most crucial foods: bananas,
God
root
nailed it on this
vegetable
one.
called taro with broad elephant ear leaves, as well as sweet potatoes and sugarcane. They also brought saplings of the paper mulberry tree, the fibers of which they used to weave clothes. And they brought animals
They
with them
do. They're
too,
little jelly
although only those
beans.
small enough to be transported.
Oh, Spruce, you get possums in your
They brought
backyard?
chicken,
Oh, I've never
and
seen a
also the
possum up where I
Polynesian
live.
rat, which was an everyday food for common people.
I think we're like right on the outside
This
of their
was an
range,
entire
maybe?
ecological system in waiting, packed up in the hulls of their canoes, optimized for transport, and ready to be transplanted to a new land. Hotumatua may
Lucky.
not have realized it, but his arrival on Easter Island was of profound significance, not just for him and his people, but for all of mankind. That's because Easter Island was the final stop on a journey of 60,000 years that had taken mankind out of Africa, through Asia and onto the Americas. The final chapter of this journey was the gradual colonization of the Polynesian islands, and Easter Island was the furthest and final piece of uninhabited land. Mankind's journey out of Africa ended on the shores of Easter Island, and with that step, a new phase of humanity's history began. I think it's worth noting at this point that apart from the evidence we can find in the archaeological record, we have essentially 2 sources of information about the history of Easter Island, and each of them has their problems. Firstly, there are the accounts of European visitors to the island, like the Dutchman Roggeveen. These accounts come down to us either in the form of ship's logs or in the form of memoirs written down when these explorers returned to their homelands. The biggest problem for researchers of Rapa Nui's history is that these early visitors to the island left behind accounts that are extremely limited in their content and their reliability, and that sometimes directly contradict each other. Most of them stayed for only a few days. They rarely wandered far from their landing spot, and they commented little on the culture, language, or society of the islanders. In the debate that has raged over what happened on Easter Island,
Thank you.
many writers
And
have
yeah,
tried
I
to
see
use
racks
a
all the time.
selective
Not
reading
not
of
in
these
Toronto,
accounts
shockingly, but plenty in
order
Ottawa.
to support their own favoured argument.
And the Benoits.
And that's something we should be very careful about as we go forward and assess the evidence. Some of these major accounts I'll post on Patreon so you can assess them for yourself. But these written records do provide us with some useful information. At times, as you'll see, they give us fixed points in time around which we can build our story. The second source of information is the oral folklore of the islanders themselves. This was passed down by word of mouth through the generations, often in the form of songs and stories. And this can give us a wonderful sense of how the islanders view their own history and their own sense of identity. But this source of information can also be very difficult to rely on when trying to sort historical fact from fiction. The different strands of the island's folklore is also often extremely contradictory, and the reason for that isn't hard to imagine. Detailed observations of these songs and stories weren't written down until the 1880s, and by that time the culture of Rapa Nui had already undergone drastic change. By this point, they had been in contact with the outside world for more than 150 years, and their population was reduced to a tiny fraction of what it had once been.
I wonder
Now,
how that
only
happened.
a few survivors passed down the stories they remembered And, to add another level of confusion, these stories were written down by early European explorers, who may have mistranslated, as well as added and embellished elements that didn't exist in the original. One example of this is the question of the name of the island.
Yeah, like living in Toronto, you get still more wildlife than I actually thought we would, because we're kind of close to a sort of green belt. But even Ottawa has so much more wildlife in comparison. And we have like a little family cottage even further. And like that's just rife. But Ottawa's actually shockingly full of animals. Like you'll get deer right up next to the river in the city. I think a couple of years ago there's like an elk that unfortunately wandered through downtown Ottawa. They had to kill it. I don't know why. But you'll get some weird shit in Ottawa every once in a while. But no opossums that I've ever seen. But they might exist there.
And it often relies on
Birdies
fragmentary
and some herons. Yes. Herons juice.
Today, new research has begun.
Your grandma
to
gets
challenge
deer.
the familiar
Oh.
narrative we've all grown up with, and we will have to deal with a lot of uncertainty as we forge ahead through the tragic story of this most remarkable island. According to tradition, the first Polynesian settlers arrived on Easter Island at a point called Anakena, a white coral sand beach on the north of the island that forms a natural harbour. And it's worth mentioning that the landscape these first settlers would have seen was very different to the one we see today on Rapa Nui. The bare, grassy slopes first spied by Roggeveen in the 18th century, and which we know from images today, would have been nowhere to be seen. In fact, they would have been covered by a thick forest of tropical palm trees. If you dig down into the earth of Easter Island today, you can still see the hollow moulds left by the roots of these trees. Studies of these root moulds, as well as pollen analysis, shows that when humans arrived on Rapa Nui, the island was home to over 21 species of trees. Some of these were large, including at least 3 which grew up to 15 meters or more. One species of palm tree, the Easter Island or Rapa Nui palm, may even have been among the largest species of palm tree in the world. This now extinct tree, known as Pascalococcus, seems to have once been the most numerous species on the island, and its closest relative today, Jubea chilensis, or the Chilean wine palm, can reach heights of over 25 meters, its bulbous trunk the thickest in the world, reaching a diameter of more than a meter. I'll put an image of this tree up on Twitter and
bulbous
Patreon for you
trunk,
to see,
thickest
as
in
well
the
as a
world.
digital
Me,
reconstruction
that's
of
me.
what the original Easter Island might have looked like. The soil of Easter Island has never been rich, but the forest would have provided a small amount of food for the new settlers. Palm nuts,
You know what?
fruits,
Actually, I
too,
forgot. On
along
top
with
of
the
my
birds and the
apartment
trees
buildings on the other
attract
side is a red hawk
Luckily for
nest. I believe it is a red
archaeologists,
hawk.
the sand of
Or maybe it's like a
Anakena
red
Beach,
flanked hawk or
the
something. It's
site
got a
of that
red
first
and it's got
settlement,
hawk in the name.
is particularly
But you'll see
good at
them
preserving
circling.
food
It's
and
I think a
remains.
mated pair circling every once in a
Because
while.
of this, skeletons
I
examined
presume
by
looking for the squirrels because we got a little bit of
insight
tree down
into the
below.
lives of the ancient Rapa Nui.
We'll get like sharp-shinned hawks in
Studies have
Ottawa,
shown
but I
that
don't
as
think I've
well
ever
as
seen a
these
red
plant
hawk
crops,
around in
people
Ottawa. They
supplemented
do
their
exist.
diet with a mix of marine animals,
They eat her flowers. The
including
deer eat her
dolphins
flowers.
they trapped in the Bay of Anakena,
Yeah, coyotes, yeah.
seals, sea turtles,
Red-shouldered.
and fish
That's it, rad beetle.
caught with hooks.
And you know what? I think I just lied. I think I have seen a red-shouldered hawk in Ottawa at Lincoln Fields.
Has shown that the
It was
people
a
make up
young
about
one.
half of their diet
Just kind of
from
sitting
sea.
on top of a light post, just
They
being
cooked
very
all of these
churlish.
foods in earth ovens known as umu, cavities dug
Yeah,
into the ground,
maybe it was red-tailed.
which then had burning grass and leaves.
Birds
piled
are
on
super
top of
cool.
them
Birds are so
that
neat.
the heat radiated downwards. These people were ingenious.
I'm
and
not quite
inherited
at
knowledge from their
the
ancestors.
like bird
They
call
made
and like I
textiles
haven't
from
gone full
fibers of the
ornithologist
Aper
on
mulberry
it
tree
or bird
and
watcher
spun
on it,
rope
but
from a
like
tree known
I
as
can
the
appreciate
hauser.
it. Like anytime they say,
And
"Oh,
with this healthy
there's
and diverse
owls
mix
out
of
by Mud
foodstuffs
Lake,"
and
like me and my
resources,
mom would like
their
pack up and
settlement
go
became
and take photos
incredibly
of
successful.
the I think it was gray owls
From there,
at Mud Lake.
using slash and burn agricultural methods,
There's
the
turkeys out in
original
Mud Lake now
settlers
too,
spread quickly across the small landmass of the island.
which is kind of
And they
scary
soon
because these
began
are
to
like
clear the forest
turkeys are big and they're land-based birds. So you'll be walking through Mud Lake, which is up, you know, sort of feels remote, but you can still hear traffic and you can still see like apartment buildings from certain angles. But you'll be walking through it, and then there'll be like a fucking dinosaur walking next to you, just to your immediate right. But that was a kind of shock. Like, I was walking with Gianni, I think, at that one time, and like I looked over and saw it, and like I froze in like animal terror for a hot second. You got attacked by 2 turkeys. I got bit by a swan once. Gosh, you know, turkeys, I feel like it's justified because we eat a shit ton of turkeys, and it's like, okay, I get it. It's self-defense. But, like, swans are dicks for no reason. Ugh, braces. Rough. Yeah, data shower. And geese, yep. Biorrhea? What's rhea? Is that a short form for something cool? Because I see that and I'm like, diarrhea. That's the autocomplete in my brain. Devil swans, yeah, so true. God, they're so evil. Still like seeing them. That's another thing I kind of miss in Toronto. Back in Ottawa, there's plenty of green spaces where the geese hang out, and I know there's places here in Toronto too, but we don't really live too close to them, where they hang out for their move down winter. Gianni was shocked when he saw all those geese, because like I think the geese fly down south, and possibly as far as Florida, but he didn't realize like how like proliferated they are in Canada, in around fall. So I'd take them down to the Britannia water treatment plant, and there's like a huge field and mud lakes right there, and just a shit ton of geese and poop. It's awesome. I would love to have bird pics, Bruce. Please do. Emu, except it doesn't look like it does, or it does look like it does crack. No, it doesn't look like it does crack. A slightly more dignified emu. And it shops at Sephora. That is so accurate. Yeah, gimme, always.
In order to plant their
I'll see
crops.
if I ever get a good shot of that red-shouldered or red-tailed hawk. I'm going to post it on Twitter as well. I'll send it over. Because just very cool to see it up and flying around and like at eye level. Because we're on like we're past the 10th floor. I won't tell you the exact floor we're on, but we are way past 10th floor, and we can see a lot from up here.
Until the whole of Rapa Nui was fully populated with around 3,000 people. Slowly, that primeval
And pinch your
palm
some as
forest
well. That's exactly
began
how
to
I got bit by a
disappear
swan.
from
I had
Easter
bird
Island.
feed, and the swan just was like, "I'm taking your finger. Fuck you, kid. Kills you." It was horrible.
I think at this point, it's worth running you through that traditional
You look up
story
Rheas.
of what happened on Easter Island.
Oh, I've
It
seen
has
those.
been
Yeah,
the dominant narrative about this island for decades.
slightly
perhaps even
nicer looking
centuries.
emus. Yeah.
It was begun by early European explorers, propagated by Victorian and 20th century anthropologists, and finally popularized by authors like the popular science writer Jared Diamond. And you might find it familiar. In this narrative, the inhabitants of Easter Island were the architects of their own demise. The story goes that their population boomed until the island could no longer support it. They cut down their trees to use as firewood, for construction material, and to use as rollers to transport their enormous statues. The loss of trees on the island resulted in an ecological collapse that destroyed the fertility of the soil, and the productive potential of the island fell apart. Along with the collapse of the island's ecology, the complex and centralized society that had built the hundreds of stone statues on the coast began to collapse too. Resources became scarce, starvation ran rampant, and this led to a period of violent civil war.
Seizes it by the
Shortly
neck.
before the arrival of the Europeans in 1722, the whole of Rapa Nui society had come apart, and only a few thousand survivors. were
Twitter.
left.
Spruce.
Jared Diamond, perhaps the greatest champion of this theory today, puts it bluntly.
In just a few centuries, the people of Easter Island wiped out their forest, drove their
Yeah,
plants and
bird
animals to
pictures,
extinction,
yeah.
and saw their complex society spiral into chaos.
This story has a widespread appeal for a number of reasons. In the latter half of the 20th century, as we became increasingly concerned about our own society's destructive impact on our environment, the story of Easter Island became irresistible as an example of the fate that might befall us if we fail to respect the environment around us.
Doing a huge
And the
jerk
stone
off gesture at this
statues,
one.
too, have proved irresistible as emblems of human folly, our desire to always build bigger and better than our neighbours. In his book, Jared Diamond even makes the comparison.
Okay, you can add me on Discord if you want, if that's too complicated. I'm perennial astronaut on Discord as well.
In an effort to prove their status. The islanders were so obsessed
Oh,
with these
kookaburra.
statues, the narrative goes, that they cut down all their trees to transport them. This single-minded obsession drove them to starvation, then cannibalism, and finally to the edge of extinction. But there are a number of problems with this narrative, a number of seriously questionable assumptions. And over the course of this episode, I'm going to try to unpick 3 of the most glaring of these assumptions so that you can assess the evidence for yourself. Firstly, there's the assumption that the Easter Islanders deforested their island due to greed, overpopulation, or even a maniacal obsession with statue building. Secondly, there's the assumption that the loss of the forest led to a societal collapse. And thirdly, there's the assumption that Easter Island society collapsed at all, at least before contact with the outside world. As we'll see, each of these assumptions has significant problems. And once we've dealt with them, we can get down to what actually happened to decimate the islanders of Rapa Nui, to strip the island of its plant life, and to leave those famous stone statues mouldering on the lone grassy hills of Easter Island. Virtually as soon as they arrived on the island, probably around the year 1200, the islanders began carving the monuments that would one day make them famous around the world. Stone statues are common on islands across the Polynesian world.
A tawny frogmouth. Ah, those guys are the freaks, right?
Or with the incredible number carved. These statues are called moai.
Oh
The
yeah,
moai
those guys
known
are
for their
such
large,
fucking
broad
messed up looking
noses
dudes.
and strong chins.
They're
along with
pretty cute though.
rectangle-shaped ears and deep eye slits. For the Easter Islanders, these statues were what they called Aringa Ora Ata Tepuna, that is, the living faces of the holy ancestors. These are stone representations.
Shut up,
of the
nerd. My house is
islanders
bigger
that
than
have gone
yours.
before.
Yeah.
Of the moai that were successfully moved into place, the vast majority stand on the coast of the island, on monolithic stone platforms called ahu. While most people's eyes are drawn by the statues, these ahu are themselves impressive undertakings. They are built of enormous stones, cut so precisely that
Extremely
they fit together
accurate
in a perfect jigsaw,
of what they
with
look
not
like.
even enough room to fit a razor blade between the stones. The largest of them, Ahu Tongariki, holds 15 moai, lined up in perfect order. Nearly all moai stand with their backs to the sea, staring inland over the fields and hills of Rapa Nui with their deep, expressive eyes. Almost all of the statues are carved from a volcanic stone known as tuff. Tuff is formed when ash from a volcanic eruption falls thickly on the ground and is then slowly compacted into solid rock. Tuff is relatively soft and easy to carve, so it has been used for construction since ancient times. It commonly occurs in Italy, for instance, and the Romans often used it in their buildings. Most of the moai statues were carved in a quarry on the outer cliff edge of the Rano Raraku crater. This quarry is an eerie sight today.
I think you and Gianni share
Here
a
and
favorite
there,
bird.
The faces of half-finished giants still peer out of the stone.
Yeah, he loves
The
shoebills.
Rano Raraku crater is 700 meters across,
Or is it sandhills?
formed of ash and volcanic tuff, thrown up in an ancient explosion.
No, I think
and
it's the
ringed by
shoebills. Because you get
cliffs
you get
160
shoebills down in
meters
Florida,
high.
right? And he was always like,
wide
"Oh man,
volcanic
check
floor
these fucking freaks
is one of
out."
the 3
I
places
didn't
on Easter
I didn't realize
Island
that Florida had
where
birds
fresh
that fucking
water
big. Like I've seen
pools run
herons
lake.
up here. Gray herons get pretty big, but
Here a kind of bulrush
again,
species
dinosaurs.
of Tora grow on the water's edge, nodding in the breeze, and the Rapa Nui people once collected them to weave thatched roofs for their houses. But it's on the outer slopes of the crater's
Bird, some kind of
cliff
finch.
that the truly important activity took place. Here, the islanders chipped their statues directly from the bedrock. using
Really?
a kind of stone
They clatter
chisel
their
known as
beaks.
a toki that was made of dense basalt, perfectly suited for carving the softer volcanic tuff. This would have
Goldfinch,
been
that's it.
incredibly slow work. Work that might take a modern craftsman with a steel chisel 1 hour might take an Easter Islander with a stone toki a whole day or 2 days to complete. And although estimates vary, it's thought that an entire statue could take over a year for a team of 12 people to carve. One fascinating aspect of this quarry is that there are a huge number of incomplete moai abandoned here, 397 in total. That's nearly half of the island's total population of 887, and this shows just how difficult the carving of these statues was. These abandoned moai have been discarded for different reasons, some more obvious than others. On some statues, it's clear that the workmen discovered a seam of hard rock somewhere on the moai's body, which would have been virtually impossible to carve with their stone tools.
That must be
Others have
so
obvious flaws
frustrating.
or cracks in them,
You get all that work
while
done
some
and it's like
moai
it
have
cracks.
fallen over while raising them.
Oh,
Other moai simply seem to have been too ambitious in size. The largest of these, nicknamed El Gigante, is nearly 22 meters in height. That's twice
Coots
the height
is just
of
a great
telephone
name.
pole or the size of a 6-story building.
oh yeah, I've seen those guys.
El Gigante, still lying on his back in the cliff face, is almost twice the size
They
of
do
any
look like
moai
chickens,
ever
though.
completed. This enormous statue
Wah.
would have weighed an estimated 270 tons, and it's hard to imagine how the islanders ever intended to move it.
Like that looks like
You might
Photoshop.
imagine
That
an
does not look
ambitious
real.
ancient craftsman
Those funny
overseeing the
feet.
carving of this vast statue, determined to create the largest moai that the island has ever seen. Or perhaps, as we'll find out later, the islanders believed they had to summon a truly enormous protective spirit to defend their island against a threat. To get a sense for how these
Oh
people
yeah,
must
these
have felt
freaks.
about these
Jacanas,
statues,
yeah.
let's imagine
Long.
ourselves into the role of a team of moai carvers.
Yeah, the
During the
classic.
golden age.
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Rapa Nui
yeah.
Statue carving.
Fucking AI ass looking image.
The work would have been slow and painstaking, but it would also have carried a great deal of responsibility. While you were carving a moai, you weren't working in the fields, and so your community was investing in your work. There must have been a lot of pride tied up in the creation of these statues, too. Before the carving could even begin, there would likely have been ceremonies and rites that had to take place. Chants and incantations designed to summon the protective spirit of the ancestor to inhabit the stone. There's an apocryphal quote often attributed to the sculptor Michelangelo.
Every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it.
Whether or not he actually said this must have been something like what the people of Rapa Nui felt as the months passed, and the great statue, its head and arms and body, slowly materialized from the cliff face in front of them. The days would have been hard. Many traditional Rapa Nui working songs survive today, and we can imagine the workers singing while they chipped away at the cliff. One surviving folk song even derives its rhythm from the striking together of two stones, emulating the sounds of the Toki tools napping away at the statue. Here it is, recorded especially for this podcast by children from the Toki School of Music on Easter Island.
That's really cool.
The workers' hands must have been covered in the blackish dust of the stone, and they would take breaks to eat meals of sweet potato and taro, along with the chicken baked white in earth ovens nearby. After much arduous work, the whole outline of the moai would be carved out. They would then deepen the cuts and hollow out the cliff behind the statue too, clambering into the narrow space and lying on their bellies as they carved. But even with the back carved out, the statue would still be attached to the bedrock below, with a narrow keel that ran the length of its spine. And so the final and most painstaking stage of the process would begin. They would gather up stones and earth in order to support the moai so that it didn't fall, and then this spine of stone would slowly be chipped away. It must have been an incredible moment when that last stone umbilical cord was cut. It was the culmination of so much time and sweat, of course, but it must have sent shivers down their spines too, as the great statue of their ancestor broke free of its stony slumber and was finally filled with a living spirit. It's likely that more ceremonies surrounded this moment, the chanting of holy men who wore white plugs in their ears, and the beating of drums. Over what must have been days, the moai was edged clear of its quarry resting place, with huge teams of workers pulling ropes spun from the hau tree. When the statue was clear, they slid it down the grassy slope of the volcano, so that it could be stood upright at the bottom of the slope. This was one of the most dangerous parts of the moai's journey, as the great number of cracked and abandoned statues on the slope below the quarry shows us. They look like an army of stony wanderers marching down from the volcano. And somewhat ironically, these abandoned statues, buried up to their necks in the refuse from the quarry, form some of the most iconic images of Easter Island today, more familiar to the layman than the completed ones that stand on the ahu platforms on the coast. This is why people talk about the stone heads of Easter Island, ignoring the fact that most of the moai have bodies. At the bottom of the hill, the workmen would raise the moai up to a standing position so they could finish carving the details on its back, using soft pumice to wear it smooth. And then they would prepare to transport the statue into its final resting place on its ahu. The carvers could wipe the sweat from their foreheads and share congratulations. But this was just the beginning of another long and arduous chapter in the moai's journey. At this point, I think it's worth noting that we don't actually know for sure how the ancient islanders moved these vast statues. This question was something that obsessed early visitors to the island. They looked around at the seemingly barren landscape of Rapa Nui, at its grassy slopes seemingly devoid of large trees, and asked how a people without metal tools, pulleys or wheels, could transport nearly 500 of these vast statues. The largest successfully transported moai, nicknamed Paro, was 10 meters tall, which is longer than a London bus. It's estimated that this statue weighed about 82 tons, heavier than a Boeing 737 aircraft when fully loaded with passengers and fuel. And the ancient islanders would sometimes transport these statues for distances of 20 kilometers across the island's rough, undulating terrain. It's a question that has been asked of the islanders since Europeans first arrived. How did your ancestors move these statues? And for a long time, the islanders would always give the same reply. They would simply say, they walked. Foreign visitors would always roll their eyes at this answer. They assumed this must be a piece of local folklore, a kind of magical thinking.
Bring Me to the Horizon
that imagined
playing.
the statues
They
to be
walked.
the living spirits of the ancestors. Some may even have thought that the Rapa Nui were making fun of them.
Aliens,
But researchers
obviously.
today have discovered that there may be more truth to this legend than
Bitten,
it seems.
bit turns. Yeah, bit turns.
Early archaeologists believed that the Rapa Nui moved the great stone statues into place using logs as rollers. In 1998, archaeologist Jo Ann van Tilburg
Yeah.
successfully tested this theory.
They might have
using a
also
large
actually
number
here. Let
of
me show you.
hardwood rollers to
Let me show you how they walked them as well. This shit's fucking crazy. Like, that shit's fucking uncanny.
Who said I couldn't walk?
That's so cool. Eve! Sticky Trina's here!
transport a
Scrub
statue
clean
for
pink.
a short distance. But recent research has cast doubt on this theory and proposed an incredible alternate
No longer
possibility.
stinky, now sweet
And the
smelling
key to
train.
discovering how the statues were actually moved lies in the ones that never made it to their intended locations.
Yeah,
Littered across Easter Island
they lost their
are the
glasses.
sad shapes
Look.
of statues that broke during their transportation.
Where are my glasses?
Only about a fifth of the moai ever carved
Vanilla
would reach their
lavender.
destination on the Ahu platforms.
I need to get more
And these total about 200.
yummy shower scents.
The rest, some
Gotta
700
get to the
more,
body shop.
were either abandoned in the quarry or along the roads. Stone heads are cracked from bodies. Decapitated statues lie mouldering and moss-covered in the long grass. For the ancient islanders, this must have been a heart-rending sight.
Oh.
A whole team had worked for a year or more, then successfully slid this statue down the slope of the volcano. Then, somewhere along its journey, it had cracked.
I hope they
and the broken
have, like, I
statue
hope there is
would
a
have to be
Maui word
abandoned
for,
by
like,
the side of
fuck!
the road. These so-called road moai have a number of interesting features. For instance, we know that the islanders waited to carve the eyes of the moai until the statues were in place on their platforms. This may have had a ceremonial purpose,
Smart.
which has parallels around the world. For instance, in Sri Lanka, when new statues of the Buddha are built, the eyes are always the last part to be painted, and only the painter is allowed in the shrine room while doing their work. But a team of archaeologists led by Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo also found something else interesting about these abandoned statues.
Let's get a little tone in the back.
They noticed that when abandoned road moai were found on uphill paths, they usually lay on their backs. And when the cracked statues were abandoned on downhill paths, they usually lay on their fronts. On flat ground, it was more like 50-50. And so a theory began to emerge. Is it possible that the statues were transported upright? Once this detail had been noticed,
Oops.
other details about the road moai seemed to fall into place. For instance, the road moai had bulkier lower halves and rounder bellies.
Oh, das
This has puzzled
Plumpen.
archaeologists for a long time, but Hunt and Lipo's theory seemed to make sense of this. The islanders were designing the moai in two phases. In the first, the transportation phase, the moai were bottom heavy like a bowling pin. And once it had been rocked into place on its platform, it was then carved into its more slender and elegant final shape. And so Lipo and Hunt proposed that the statues were rocked back and forth by teams of islanders with ropes, so that the statues actually seemed to walk over the ground. Their team caused an international sensation when they were able to successfully walk a scale model of a moai cast in concrete,
I think that's what we just
rocking
saw.
it back and forth along the road, with 3 teams holding
Football!
ropes.
Bullet!
In this way,
What's up,
the
Doc?
statue could literally walk down the path, just as the ancient folklore recounted. The team managed to move the statue at a rate of about 100 meters in an hour, meaning it could have walked around a kilometer in a day. And of course, I'll put a video of this on Patreon for you to see. If this is indeed how the statues were moved, it must have been an incredible sight to see. The tallest moai weighed over 80 tons, and each one of the statue's footsteps would have thundered on the earth, so that it really seemed like a giant was stamping its way towards the platform. There would have likely been a huge amount of ceremonial activity around the walking of these statues too. People coming from all over the island to watch, singing and dancing and all kinds of activity. For the days and weeks it took to transport one of these statues, it would have really felt like a god had come down to earth. I love the romance and imagination behind Lipo and Hunt's theory, and I think they build a convincing case that this was indeed how the statues were moved. But you might ask, well, why does it matter how the statues were moved?
You
Isn't this a
stupid
minor
bitch!
detail of the story of this society's
Why?
collapse? Well, actually,
I would love for him to say
this
that.
question has come to
Just
take
get
on
completely
an
fucking
enormous
furious.
significance for the mystery of what happened on Easter Island. The traditional narrative, if you remember, was that the Rapa Nui Islanders became so obsessed with building their statues that they destroyed their environment to do so. The islanders cut down all their trees, the theory says, in order to use as scaffolds and rollers to transport them. If this was the case, then each statue must have taken hundreds, if not thousands of trees to transport, and this seemed the obvious answer to why the island was so deforested, why its ecology collapsed and its society followed. But if Lipo and Hunt were correct, and the statues were walked into place, then very little wood was needed, and the whole narrative of the moai causing the collapse of the island's ecology comes into question. And so, the whole mystery of Easter Island.
I wonder if we
seems
have
to
any
hinge on this question
well-documented,
of whether the
maybe
statues
European
whether
logs,
they
shipping, handling of certain goods. One might call them human
So
goods.
what do we know about the loss of
Across
trees on Easter
Polynesia.
Island?
If only
One
we had
thing
some
can say for
paperwork.
sure,
Hmm.
the subtropical palm forest that the first settlers found on the island wouldn't long survive the arrival of humans. One of the earliest casualties of this deforestation
Possum.
was the largest of the island's trees, the Rapa Nui palm. If we want to guess at how this enormous tree grew, we can look at its closest surviving relative, the Chilean wine palm. This tree takes 50 years to reach its full height, and until then it doesn't produce a single fruit. This slow-growing and slow-reproducing tree would have been one of the most affected by the arrival of humans. Some theorists, Jared Diamond included, have argued that the Easter Island palm would have been in high demand for use as rollers to transport the giant moai across the island. But experiments have found that the palm would have been exceptionally badly suited for this job. The hard
It
outer
was
shell of
shit.
the palm trunk conceals a soft center that would have been instantly crushed beneath the heavy stone statues.
That's me. That's me for real.
Diamond has even argued that the palm may have been cut down in order to build large canoes. But nowhere else in Polynesia are canoes built from palm trunks.
Diamond sounds like a fucking
and they would
dumbass.
be
I'm not
very
gonna lie to you guys.
unsuitable for this purpose. So what did happen to Easter Island's trees? Well, undoubtedly, much of the forest was cut down by humans. But they didn't do this unconsciously or foolishly. They did it for the same reason that people in Iceland or England cut down their forests. Because they were farmers. The Rapa Nui, like all Polynesians, farmed energy.
Jared Diamond again. I'm getting pretty sick of this jackass.
Taro and sugarcane. These abundant foods were vastly more productive than whatever food they could have gathered from the forest. So much of this deforestation was controlled and conscious, and actually improved the quality of these people's lives. But that isn't to say there wasn't an ecological collapse on Easter Island. Pollen
Yes,
analysis
sometimes shit happens.
shows that virtually all large trees were lost from the island
Ooh.
within a matter of centuries.
Oh,
And by
wait, that's
far the
conspiracy
largest
too.
factor appears to have been something very small. That's one of the animal companions that the original settlers brought with them, the Polynesian rat.
No.
Wherever
Don't
these
blame it on the
Pacific
rats.
explorers went, they brought animals with them.
Aminal.
Each Polynesian island got some combination of these 4 animals: pigs, dogs, chickens, and rats.
Don't ask what they did with
On
the dogs.
Rapa Nui, only rats and chickens were introduced. Some argued that these rats may have stowed away on the canoes, just as they do on larger vessels.
Nah, rats too
But rat
delicious.
has actually been a foodstuff that Polynesians have relied on throughout history. It was never a delicacy, and seems to have been considered a food of the common people.
Okay,
as
I
rat
love
bones are
rats,
rarely found in the
but I
rubbish
would try
dumps of
rat.
high-status houses.
once.
However, they were a good and
Like if I could
reliable
dissect a
source
rat in biology
of
class,
long
I could
voyages.
have a rat skewer, you know what I
I
mean?
can't speak to personal experience, but accounts I've read say that rat tastes oily and gamey, a little like rabbit. And another advantage to this source of food.
Oh
is
shit,
that
you've actually
rats
read him?
reproduce incredibly
So is he a jackass? I don't actually know if
Once
he's a
the
jackass.
Polynesian
He could have
rat
just been
was
wrong about this
introduced to
one
Easter
particular
Island,
thing.
its spread would have been unstoppable.
Ah, my bones.
The millions of
Freedom!
giant palm trees covering the island would have provided them with an almost unlimited supply of their favorite food, palm nuts. Recent lab studies
Me when I'm a
have
rat
shown
and
that
their
the
palm
reproductive
nuts.
potential of rats under these ideal conditions can be enormous.
Ugh.
In fact, the rat population could have doubled every 47 days until they reached a
Hey, enjoy!
population of up
Oh
to
gosh,
3
yeah.
million,
And now
the
you can like
island
play with
was
the
completely
the
overrun.
stubble, like just go like whip 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 back
The
and forth.
rats
So
would
fun.
have quickly eaten the seeds and palm nuts from the trees, preventing the forest from regenerating. In Anakenna Beach and
Okay.
Silent Caves,
Okay, he
archaeologists
seems
found
reasonable.
The earliest remnants
All right.
of palm nut shells,
Diamond gets a
showing
little
the
bit of
tooth marks
redemption.
of rats. As well as damaging the forests, rats would also have eaten the eggs of seabirds, finishing off those
eggs.
the islanders hadn't trapped and eaten. And since the seabirds fertilized the soil with their droppings, this would have spelled disaster for the biodiversity of Easter Island.
Uh-oh.
But the question is, did this loss of trees cause a societal collapse on Rapa Nui? And the answer to that question is almost certainly not.
Okay, you know what? I think I'm gonna call this one just about wrapped.
This isn't to say that the loss of palm forest on Rapa Nui didn't present a number of challenges to the islanders.
I would find it easy.
By around the year 1650, pollen studies show that the deforestation of Easter Island was complete. Without tree cover, the ocean winds could now blow right across the island. The wind and storms threatened to blow away the topsoil, and salt spray from the sea effectively salted the earth in coastal regions, damaging the soil further. But in all cases, the Rapa Nui Islanders reacted to these challenges with ingenuity and creativity. They transformed their island
Thank
not into a
you.
desolate wasteland,
I will be packing this up
but
and
into an
sending it to you
astonishingly
soon,
effective
Stinky
system
Tree.
of
Thank you
gardens,
again.
orchards, and farmland.
Well, thanks for taking me up on my offer, I should say.
In fact, archaeologists have found evidence of areas of the island.
Actually, can I shill for you, Stinky Treen? Are you currently taking commissions or in need of any shouting out? Stinky Treen did Gianni's Gabriel VTuber as well as his beefy Smiley Bomb VTuber. Not his current one. Right now, he's kind of rocking the little guy because he's craving simplicity with his streams right now. But I'm pretty sure that the big guy will be making a reappearance. Okay. I gotta mod some people or something like that who's linking I trust. I think like everybody currently in this room now I trust with like any links they send. I should just enable it. But let me pull up. Stinky Trina is so fucking talented. Stinky TM. Let me pull up your card. I'm gonna drop your card in chat and people can figure it out. But if they wanted to do a brief introduction of what they do, what they prefer to do, what they're doing now for delicious sweet money. Yeah, they are. Also, Trine, you should tell me if you want me to pay you for that now because I want to pay full price for it or later. Because I also don't want to pressure you because you took it on of your own volition. I don't know. I'm insane. I would be like, oh, do I feel pressured because I said I'd do this and now they want to pay me? I don't know. But you just let me know, because I am now in funds. I'm gonna kill you, Stinky Treen. Oh, what's this? Trello? Oh, let's see. Well, we're gonna find, don't worry, I'll find a way to pay you, Treen. You're in trouble. I'm just gonna let you marinate in that. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Oh God. See, I've had this happen to me all the time, and now I get to be the person at the end of the let me pay you shtick. It is. And that's at hotmail.com. That should work. And if that doesn't work, well, I got your Discord. But also no rush on finishing that too if you got other stuff that you need to work on. I'll kill you. I'll kill you if you're at all stressed about finishing that up. Consider it a donation, in fact. Gets you. I'll kill you. Well, you better enable tips. All right. I will wrap this one up and move on to the next one. I just need to check and make sure I had a couple of questions about this particular next one just to... Perfect. Never mind. It's all figured out. What I imagined I had to do, I have to do. Foxy. Okay, no one get excited. That's his other leg behind there. We're not... Don't get too excited. We got our little reference here. I wanted to make sure that I could actually draw this angle, and I can. Next one's for Voss, possibly. Is there a handle? Pee-pee! Business. Listen, this isn't Picardo. We can't get away with that here. Winky! Pebness. Weenus. We're getting a lot of different names here. I'm delighted. I forgot Winky was one. All right. Let's get Easter Island back on here.
Cultivated them. And around this time, they also began farming using a technique known as rock mulching. This involved laying rock beds around the island, which prevented the soil from washing or blowing away. It also reduced the amount of water evaporated by the sun and increased the amount of nutrients available to growing plants as the rainwater flowed over the rocks and carried minerals to their roots. Rock mulching has been used by cultures around the world who live in harsh, water-poor environments. It's been observed in the Negev Desert in Israel, the pebbled fields of Langzhou in China, the ash fields of the Canary Islands, and the fields of the Anasazi culture in New Mexico. And the Rapa Nui set about the task of rock mulching with the same great energy that they used to carve and transport the moai. They would ultimately cover half the landmass of their island in rock gardens of this kind. It was an enormous task. It's been calculated that over the 400 years that the practice was engaged in, it would have taken over 150 men working daily to construct these vast assemblages made up of billions of stones. And there's strong evidence that the Rapa Nui people also took advantage of the deep underground caverns of the island. The caves of Easter Island were formed by lava tubes, which developed during the volcanic eruptions that raised the islands out of the sea. When lava flows out of the mouth of a volcano, it forms vast underground rivers as the lava on the surface cools and hardens into rock. When the eruption ends and the lava stops flowing, the tubes drain their lava, leaving enormous caverns that look as though a monstrous worm has eaten its way through the rock. These tubes are as wide as a subway tunnel, and Easter Island has one of the largest systems of volcanic caves in the world. The islanders' relationship with these caves goes back to the first known moment of their history, as this piece of Rapa Nui
Lurkin.
folklore
I see a
about
tree.
King Hotumatua
Be good.
shows.
What tube in their lava?
The explorers
Yeah, get
went
that
to the
animation
west
done.
side of the island and
I will not
discovered a
stimulate
surfing
you.
spot.
There will
They
only be
rowed away
education.
to the right and called the place where they landed Hangaroa. They rowed away
Yeah,
to
get
the
that lunch.
left and landed at Apina Iti. They caught more waves, then went ashore and rested in a cave at Pupaka Kina.
Some of these caves can stretch for 3 or 4 kilometers into the island's rock. And as the forests of Rapa Nui retreated, its people increasingly turned to these caves to provide cover for their crops. They cultivated vast underground gardens where they could grow sweet potatoes and yams to supplement their diet. They also constructed circular rock walls called manavai that could be as much as 6 feet tall and where they could grow a variety of crops. These kept plants safe from the destructive elements of the weather, reduced the amount of water runoff, and concentrated nutrients. Archaeologists have identified over 2,500 of these rock gardens around the island, but this is likely only a fraction of the original number. Studies have shown that even today, with no active maintenance being done on them, these rings of rock are still operating as designed by the ancient gardeners. Levels of phosphorus and potassium, crucial minerals for plants, are much higher inside the manavai than outside, with the concentrations being sometimes 2 or 3 times as high. Simply put, with their rock gardening techniques, the Rapa Nui were able to make the land much more productive after the forest was cleared than it was before. Some of this great agricultural potential is hinted at in the accounts of the first Dutch sailors to land on the island, although I will once again caution about trusting too much in these accounts. I'll post the full text of it on
You literally
Patreon
cannot
for you
trust
to
the
read
Dutch.
and make up your own minds.
Oh, do you have any
Although
spices?
Roggeveen
Oh,
believed Rapa Nui
yeah.
to be a treeless, sandy wasteland from a distance, when he actually landed on the island, he was surprised to find it a productive landscape.
We found it not only not sandy, but on the contrary, exceedingly fruitful, producing bananas, potatoes, sugarcane of remarkable thickness, and many other kinds of the fruits of the earth. This place, as far as its rich soil and good climate are concerned, is such that it might be made into an earthly paradise.
Another of Roggeveen's officers, a man named Carl Friedrich Behrens, seems also to contradict this account of a treeless island, and reported on a wide variety of uses the islanders had for palm leaves.
They gave us palm branches as peace offerings. Their houses were set up on wooden stakes, daubed over with luting and covered with palm leaves.
In fact, Behrens paints a remarkably positive impression of the island overall.
This island is a suitable and convenient place at which to obtain refreshment, as all the country is under cultivation and we saw in the distance whole tracts of woodland.
And Roggeveen himself also witnessed cultivated groves of fruit trees on the island.
It was now deemed advisable to go to the other side of the island, the principal place of their plantations and fruit trees, for all the things they brought to us of that kind were fetched from that quarter.
So here, a relatively clear picture is beginning to emerge. We can say for sure that the arrival of humans on Rapa Nui resulted in the disappearance of most of its forest. But this is true of virtually every forested island on Earth after the arrival of people. And no one has yet been able to draw a clear causative link between the loss of the forest on Rapa Nui and the collapse of so-called complex society. In fact, studies done on the skeletons of islanders from around this time showed that they suffered from less malnutrition than the average European. This all seems to be backed up by Roggeveen's account of his first visit to the island. It's clear from his account that when he arrived, the Rapa Nui islanders weren't starving. They didn't make any attempt to beg for food from the newcomers. In fact, they were much more interested in the Europeans' hats. And one brave islander even climbed through a porthole on Roggeveen's ship to steal a tablecloth. But
Based.
there's no account of
Oh,
them
hey, boss!
stealing the Europeans' food. In fact, it was the Dutch, malnutritioned on a diet of salt meat and hard tack after weeks
What,
at sea,
speculoos not
who begged
enough?
the islanders for food, giving
Please.
them cloth and linen in exchange for 60 chickens and 30
Listen, I love my Oma's cooking. Actually, that's a flat statement. My Oma's cooking is great. Dutch, like, home meals are usually delicious. Dutch snacks, though, F tier, in my opinion. As a Dutch person, absolute bottom tier snacks. Cannot stand speculoos. Salt licorice, horrible, although I do appreciate the grind set. What else do we even have? Okay, chocolate letters are pretty good. That's it. That's it. Like a nice fried croquette, awesome. But no wonder those poor Dutch people were, like, underfed.
bunches of bananas. None of this sounds like the behavior of a people living on the edge of starvation.
Yeah, it took me a
multiple
second.
abundant sources
I
of
looked
food,
at his patterning a little bit more, and I'm like, oh no, that's not a fox. That's got to be a Maine wolf. Maine wolves are so cool.
alongside the efficient use of the land around them, archaeological and written evidence begins to make that popular scenario of starvation and even cannibalism look patently absurd. Part and parcel of the starvation narrative is the assumption that the society of the island descended into a period of brutal conflict, once resources ran scarce. But if resources were abundant, can we also question this assumption?
Yeah, I think
Folklore
they
of the
did.
islanders
Which
does
actually is pretty
record a
based.
period of warfare, after which the Moai building culture faded into obscurity. But as we've seen, this folklore can be unreliable at the best of times. Much more reliable is the archaeological record. And when a period of conflict occurs in such an environment, the evidence is usually hard to miss. One great example of this is the island of Fiji, another Pacific island 7,000 kilometers away. In Fiji, archaeologists have found the remains of strong hilltop forts and fortified towns, all pointing to a period of warfare. In Hawaii, it's well documented that chiefs fought each other in large battles featuring hundreds of warriors armed with clubs. The signs of war in the archaeological record aren't difficult to spot. Increased number of weapons, increased building of defensive structures, and skeletal remains that bear the marks of violence. And first, let's look at the evidence of weapons on Rapa Nui. The islanders
Yeah,
did
weren't
make
they, like,
blades from
super
the black
elaborately
volcanic
carved?
glass obsidian. Obsidian forms in the vents of volcanic eruptions when lava reaches the surface and cools quickly, forming a glassy material that is brittle but has exceptionally sharp edges. In fact, obsidian blades have been measured to be up to
My current gallery doesn't really reflect it, but like I was not big time furry artist, but like dedicated like my entire teenage and early 20s to drawing furry art. So it is really nice to be back. I should draw more. I have to like literally target furries now. Please commission me.
thousand times sharper than a steel scalpel. The Rapa Nui gave their blades names depending on their shape. Fishtail, rat spine, banana leaf are some examples. Some writers have argued that the large amount of these blades found points to a mass production of weaponry and a period of conflict. But studies of these blades have found that their edges were mostly covered in vegetable matter, that's sweet potato and taro, and they were found in the highest concentrations in the area of the islanders' rock gardens, where they were most likely used for everyday tasks like the preparation of food. Studies of skeletons have also seemed to undermine this picture of conflict. In a historical zone of conflict, we would expect to see skeletons missing their heads, for instance, or skulls with arrowheads inside, broken bones, and bones bearing scratches from blades glancing off them. But studies of skeletal remains on Easter Island have shown that the islanders were in fact remarkable for their mostly peaceful existence. Only around 2% of the skeletons studied have been found to have suffered trauma from blunt and cutting weapons, and this isn't a large proportion of the population. I do think here it's also worth remembering Behrens's observation that the islanders were unarmed when they first came to meet the Dutch explorers. And in the search for defensive structures, archaeologists have also found themselves frustrated. The small Pacific island of Rapa Iti, for instance, is 5 times smaller than Easter Island, and yet it has no fewer than 14 hilltop fortresses. On Rapa Iti, life on the island actually did descend into a nightmare of violence and civil war, and the signs
Powerful
of this are hard
furry
to
artist.
miss. Fortifications on Rapa Iti involve watchtowers.
Yeah, I think the
and walls,
schneuz is a little bit
ditches, and
narrow.
wooden palisade
It's because I'm
fences.
half kind of like using the reference and just
Find
half kind of
weapons
following
here
it around.
and
I think I'm
human
gonna
remains
hit it with
bearing
like
the
a
marks of
smooch
violence.
tool.
But on Easter Island, no such
Yeah.
fortifications exist.
Oh my god, more.
One feature known as the Poika Ditch was long assumed
The
to be
furry
a
equivalent of like
defensive
an
structure,
Aqualine nose.
but recent investigations have shown that it's actually a natural feature caused by the collision of 2 lava flows. Some walls, built at the entrances to caves, have also been used as evidence of the islanders fortifying themselves, but there's little other evidence of the caves being used as military strongholds, and in fact they seem to be more commonly used as hiding places. So another one of our assumptions about Easter Island has been taken away. Now we're left having to explain how Rapa Nui's culture could actually have been less violent than many other comparable societies, and certainly less violent than any city of Europe at the time. We may never know what decides whether a small community will descend into a violent hell like Rapa Iti, or whether they will work together to maintain the peace like on Rapa Nui. Some have suggested that the Rapa Nui Islanders, all descended from that first colonization attempt, would have had many family relations between tribes, and so it may have been unthinkable to escalate conflict beyond the occasional feud or skirmish. When a rival chief is also the husband of your wife's sister's aunt, for instance, you might try to avoid excessive conflict and reach for peaceful compromises. That is, if you want to avoid a frosty atmosphere at your dinner table. On a small island, word travels fast, and it doesn't pay to be viewed as overly aggressive. Some historians have even argued that the construction of the Moai themselves may have helped prevent conflict by allowing the island's different communities to compete for dominance in a non-violent way. And another way this may have occurred is through an incredible ritual known as the Birdman competition. The later history of the island is dominated by the cult of a mysterious figure known as the Tangata Manu, or the Birdman. Cave paintings on Easter Island show
The
this
Dutch are trying
ceremonial
so
figure
hard.
with the body of a man but the head and wings
We
of a
have
bird.
cannons, please.
Each year, the men of
We have
Rapa
a
Nui
navy.
took part in a ceremony
Don't you know who we
that
are?
allowed them to become the human embodiment of this figure for the next year. It was a test of strength and daring that is astonishing to even contemplate today. The contestants who competed to become the Birdman had a simple enough task. Off the southwest
I'm
coast
talking all this
of
shit
Rapa
about
Nui,
Holland, but I would
there is a
absolutely jump
small
at the
cluster of
opportunity to go
islands.
back and visit.
And one of these is a rocky outcrop known as Motunui, which is home to several species of nesting birds. Among these is the black tern, which we've already seen held a mystical significance for Polynesian sailors. These birds seem to be gifted with a magical ability to lead sailors home, and it's not hard to see how they would have assumed a powerful religious significance. The Birdman contest took place in the spring, during the laying season of the black terns. Young men who wanted to become that year's Birdman would have to swim out to the rocky island of Motunui, a distance of about 1 kilometre, through choppy seas and powerful currents. Once they reached the island, they had to climb up through the flocks of cackling seabirds and search through their nests, looking for the first egg of the season. Sometimes they would have to wait there for days. But when they found their
It is
precious
really nice.
prize, they had to swim all the way back to Rapa Nui with the egg in hand. Then
Sorry to pause the Birdman ritual, but it's really cool to, like, Canada has about equivalent aged buildings of what I saw in Amsterdam, like all around maybe like 200 or 300 years old. Like, we've got a couple of forts in around here that are pretty yucky and ancient, but I guess not relatively speaking. But actually being like in Europe and seeing how much more history was there, or at least physical history, I should say, was really cool. And seeing all these villages that were like functionally unchanged from like 200 years ago, save for like a little bit of infrastructure, but like visually the same, was really cool.
dripping with cold salt water, they had to climb the sheer 300-meter cliff of the volcano Ranukoa. The first man to complete this incredible triathlon event would be crowned the Birdman. It's unclear how much power this figure actually had, but in terms of status, there was no higher honor. And allowing men to battle it out in this test of strength every year may have played a role in reducing the violence of the island.
Can I confirm that there are no
So on
rats
Easter
in
Island,
Alberta? I actually have no
seems
idea.
to suggest that
I've
there was
heard
no
of that, but I
starvation.
think it is
There
now
was no
untrue.
widespread
There are
warfare.
now rats in Alberta.
And so you might be left asking, did their society even collapse at all? And the answer to
Thank
that
God.
is yes, but not when you think it did. For early European explorers, there was no greater mystery than what they called the riddle of Easter Island. The French seafarer and artist Pierre Loti wrote about it in the 19th century.
There exists in the midst of the great ocean, in a region where nobody goes, a mysterious and isolated island. The island is planted with monstrous great statues, the work of I don't know what race, today degenerate or vanished.
Okay,
Great
H.P.
mystery,
Lovecraft.
An enigma.
Ooh, the statues
We've
are
actually
so
encountered
scary.
this kind of thinking a number of times over the course of this series. When European explorers discovered the ruins of past civilizations, they often found it hard to believe that so-called primitive people had a hand in their construction.
Okay, it would actually be kind of haunting, seeing a
Whether
bunch
it's
of
assuming the
statues on an
ruins of
island like
Angkor
that.
were
I,
built
I
by the
would probably
Romans,
be a little freaked out.
or that the Mayan ruins of Tikal were built by the citizens of Atlantis, European writers have often struggled to believe that the indigenous people of other lands were capable of great construction.
Here it is, folks, ancient
This
aliens.
kind of thinking follows a circular logic. Only a so-called advanced civilization could have built these things. But the people I see living here don't look like an advanced civilization. Therefore, these people can't have built these monuments. The problems with this kind of thinking are obvious. It deceives us into thinking that an advanced civilization can only look like a European civilization, highly centralized and organized. And the very notion of a society being advanced suggests that human progress follows a fixed and
Yeah, I
inevitable
think he did.
path, and that our way of organizing our
I wonder what he
societies
named
and
his cat.
economies
Yeah.
is the only one.
He also
It's
like
this kind of
married a
thinking
Jewish
that
person
made
or a Jewish
early
woman, but
explorers
he also
use
said
the
like,
island
oh, she's so well
the
integrated.
advanced
Like,
rock
oh,
melting
thanks, HP.
techniques of the Rapa Nui people and see only a wasteland scattered with rocks. This belief system found its logical conclusion in the Norwegian adventurer and archaeologist Thor Heyerdahl. Heyerdahl believed that the Polynesian islands had been populated not by Polynesians, hopping the islands from the west, but from people from South America, traveling by raft from the east. He also believed, curiously, that these people must have been white-skinned and European in origin. He simply couldn't comprehend the idea that other peoples around the world could have developed such artistic and architectural skills. So what appeared to be a puzzle to early European visitors wasn't actually a puzzle at all. The stone statues of Easter Island hadn't been built by some vanished ancient culture, but by the people who lived there already, and seemed
Absolute
to
cringe,
Europeans
yeah.
to be so simple. This idea of a society
He's literally so cringe.
before contact with the Europeans has survived
God.
to our day, even though it has very little basis in fact. But this doesn't mean that a collapse didn't occur on Rapa Nui. In fact, the island would soon undergo one of the most dramatic examples of societal and cultural destruction that can be found in history. But it wasn't because
I should have
they
looked
cut
up a
down
reference for this
trees.
drapery. I'm just going to leave that drapery alone, and if we have time towards the end, I'll
There is
fix
one
that.
event in
We'll
Easter
get the
Island's
anatomy
history
down first and then
that I
finish
think
this.
encapsulates the complete
We'll just
destruction
just
of
turn that
the
layer
survey
off,
environment
actually. Let's just do that.
and its poor, unsuspecting inhabitants. That's the toppling, in only a few years, of every one of the island's statues.
No!
For centuries, the islanders had loved and revered the moai that their ancestors had spent generations carving and transporting. And in 1722, the Dutch sailor Barents recounts what he saw of the islanders' devotion to these statues.
They kindle fire in front of certain remarkably tall stone figures they set up, and thereafter, squatting on their heels with heads bowed down, they bring the palms of their hands together and alternately raise and lower them.
But with every subsequent European visitor to the island, this situation seemed to change. On the 15th of November 1770, 48 years after the first European visit, a second arrived. 2 Spanish ships landed there and spent 5 days on the island, performing a very thorough survey of its coast. They renamed the island Isla de San Carlos and claimed it on behalf of King Charles III of Spain. They also ceremoniously erected 3 wooden crosses and a Spanish flag on a hill. And when they explored the island, it seems that all of the 200 erected statues were still standing. But 4 years later, the famous British explorer Captain Cook
Who?
sailed past the island and found a much different situation. Cook's diary of Thursday the 17th
we're gonna
of
lengthen
March
this leggy a little bit.
1774 gives his account of the impoverished state of the island.
Puts you in the
This is
shin
undoubtedly
breaker.
the same island in April
There we go.
1722, although the description given of it by the author of that voyage does by no means correspond with it now. No nation will ever contend for the honor of the discovery of Easter Island, as there is hardly an island in this sea which affords less refreshments and conveniences for shipping than it does.
I know what they meant by refreshment, but I'm thinking of like, oh, it didn't have any tea
Anything fit
cakes.
for man to eat or drink, and the natives are but few and plant no more than sufficient for themselves.
Oh.
If Cook's account is to be believed, the population size of Easter Island also seems to have taken a serious hit.
The inhabitants of this isle
Dutch is a very silly language, deeply unserious language. I tried learning it a couple of years back, and it's just like, how many A's do you need in a
And
sentence?
there's another
That is
significant
cool.
detail too. Cook noted
Got a
that
polyglot.
Islanders now carried weapons when approaching foreign visitors.
It's bad.
Their arms are wooden patapataos and clubs.
We dunk a lot on German, but honestly, like, German is like rigid and nice. Dutch is just like woo 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 woo
which are
woo.
pointed at one end with pieces
Although I have a lot of nostalgia for it, especially when like old
But the
people are
final
speaking
tragic
Dutch.
detail
I'm like, ah
is
yes.
that in the 4
Grandparents.
years since the Spanish expedition, virtually all of the standing moai on the island had been toppled.
When we visited, my brother finally fit in. He's like
on the
6 foot,
east side, near the
6'5",
sea.
and
They met
fucking
with
blonde.
3 platforms of stonework, or rather the ruins of them.
And
On each had stood 4 of
when he
those
visited,
large
like finally,
statues,
like there was no
but they
glances,
were
and like
all
all the
fallen
women were
down.
like his height.
All except one were broken by the fall, or in some measure defaced.
Gotta send that boy
The
back.
practice of statue toppling is called huri moau in the Rapa Nui language, and it continued into the 1830s.
Actually, maybe this drape will be better if I
By
erase some of it.
1838, every single coastal moai had been taken down.
Give
Now
me an
the
in
only
clap
standing
up up.
statues were those
Spank me
abandoned
daddy.
on the
Oh,
slopes below the
good lord.
quarry at Rano Raraku. So what happened to make the islanders start to carry weapons. What caused their population
They love their
to
silent
increase
E's.
so heavily?
I did study
What
French
made
because
them
Canada,
turn
but
so dramatically against their gods?
languages are just funny.
Well, the answer to that may lie in the very event that opened this episode, and which we've returned to a number of times. That's the arrival of 3 Dutch sails on the horizon on Easter Day, 1722.
I'm hearing there's some
At the
free
sight of
stuff
the
over
enormous
here,
ships
guys.
dropping anchor some way off the
Let's go
coast,
check it
the
out.
Easter Islanders gathered on the shore in astonishment. They must have felt how we would feel if a vast alien spaceship.
And then you meet a
one day
prime
arrived
minister.
on the sea. It must have been a mix of
Yeah, it's
fear
like, isn't it
and
like
hope,
Middle German or some?
a sense that the world would never quite be the same
Very
again.
interesting. Languages are so cool.
They selected one of their number.
Terrible at learning
who
them, but
must have
very
been
interested.
The bravest of them all. It's not unlikely, I think, that he would have been the winner of the most recent Birdman competition, the island's champion and protector. This man got in his canoe and rowed out to meet the strange vessels, whose white sails must have looked brilliant and dazzling in the sunlight. Perhaps he wouldn't have immediately realized how large they were until he got up close and their prows began to loom over his small canoe. When he approached, he saw that there were men on board, and he waved to them. The Dutch officer, Carl Friedrich Behrens, wrote about this incredible encounter.
During the morning, Captain Booman brought an Easter Islander on board, together with his craft. This hapless creature seemed to be very glad to behold us.
Okay, kind of rude.
Greatest wonder at the build of our ship. He took special notice of the tautness of our spars, the stoutness of our rigging and running gear, the sails, the guns, which he felt all over with minute attention.
This is kind of
Every
cute, like
little
two
thing he
shipbuilding
saw.
cultures, kind of like,
When
whoa.
the image of his own features was displayed before him in a mirror, he started suddenly back, and then looked towards the back of the glass, apparently in the expectation of discovering there the cause of the apparition. After we had sufficiently beguiled ourselves with him, and he with us, we started him off again in his canoe towards the shore.
But this light-hearted encounter conceals a dark truth about Roggeveen's visit.
It is about to get sad,
In
folks.
fact, when Roggeveen and his men went ashore, their visit would turn to tragedy. It's clear from both accounts that the Europeans were nervous.
I think South Africa is,
They had heard stories of violent encounters.
I mean, it's better now.
And it's worth noting that the novel Robinson Crusoe had been published only 3 years before, full of garish stories of cannibalism and murder. Despite their guns and cannons, it's clear that the islanders frightened them, and the natural curiosity and boldness of the Rapa Nui people seemed to make matters worse. When the Dutchmen got ashore, the islanders pressed around them, grabbing at their hats and clothes, and even touching the guns
Bait.
they carried. It's not clear which Dutchman shot first. but the
It's
situation
okay. It's still kind of
quickly
fucked.
spiraled out of control. The Europeans fired into the unarmed crowd of islanders.
No.
Their guns were flintlock pistols and rifles that would have sent up puffs of smoke, and the cries of people shot would have rang out, with the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Behrens recounts what happened next, as he recognized a familiar face among the murdered islanders.
Many of them were shot at this juncture, and among the slain lay the man who had been with us before, at which we were much grieved. In order to obtain possession of the bodies, they congregated in great numbers, bringing with them presents of various kinds.
Oh my God, they
fruits,
brought them presents.
vegetables, in order that we might the more readily surrender to them their slain. The consternation of these people was by no means abated. Even with their children's children in that place will, in times to come, be able to recount the story of it.
We can assume that what Behrens said is true. The story of this violent encounter must have reverberated through the history of the Rapa Nui people. It would have destabilized their ancient beliefs and rocked their very sense of the world around them. Remember that Behrens mentions that the islanders didn't have any weapons at this point, that they only prayed to their gods for protection. Now imagine what would happen to this belief system when visitors arrived from the sea, killed multiple islanders with what must have appeared to be magic weapons. And then when these visitors walked around the island, even approaching the statues, and then sailed away unharmed. When you think about this encounter through that lens, it becomes a lot clearer why the Rapa Nui might have lost faith in their ancestors. But the sad truth is that the European bullets were not the deadliest legacy they left behind. The true killer of the Rapa Nui would have been something much smaller. Invisible microbes, viruses and bacteria to which the islanders' immune systems had never been exposed. Europe has always been a crossroads between many different peoples, sometimes separated by hundreds.
It's a nice way of saying it's very stinky.
Europe's constant wars and exchange of trade spread localized diseases across the continent. And each year the Silk Road brought fresh shipments of disease from China and India, along with silk.
Fresh shipments of disease, Jesus.
This all resulted in Europeans becoming immune to a large variety of diseases. But although the diseases didn't affect them, they could still carry them. And for populations that had not suffered the same exposure, these germs could be devastating. In pathology, this phenomenon is known as the virgin soil effect. It's not recorded what diseases may have been transmitted. In other parts of the uncontacted world, cholera, measles, diphtheria, and even the bubonic plague swept through populations. By even the lowest estimates, indigenous populations were reduced by 80% right across the Americas. 4 out of every 5 people died, and it's likely that in the even more isolated environment of Easter Island,
I should stop putting on like the bummer episodes, but they're all bummer episodes. It's called Fall of Civilizations.
Polynesian islands, the reduction in population after first contact was as much as 90%. And so in the decades after the Dutch visit, we can imagine disease ravaging the helpless population of Rapa Nui. It's possible that the population of the island may have crashed from a height of around 3,000 to only a few hundred. The population may have only just recovered by the time, 48 years later, that the Spanish arrived and delivered a whole new dose of invisible death to the islanders. The Rapa Nui people wouldn't have been able to understand why this was happening to them. In fact, if you'd asked the Europeans of the time what caused these diseases, they wouldn't know either. They may have told you that they were caused by miasmas or bad night air, this being the prevailing theory at the time. As whole families of islanders died, the Rapa Nui must have believed that the ancestors they had so laboriously carved to protect the island had failed them. By the time the Spanish brought the second wave of disease, and it began ravaging the population all over again, those looming monoliths on the coast may have begun to represent not protective spirits, but the very spectres of death themselves, and the islanders, one by one, began to bring them down. Soon, these fallen giants would litter the landscape. Now, only those abandoned moai, half buried in the runoff from the quarry, would remain upright, and the age of Easter Island's statues would come to an end. The loss of Easter Island's culture was an incalculable tragedy for our understanding of humanity. One of the reasons this is true is that Easter Island may have been one of the few places on Earth where writing was independently invented. A kind of script called Rongo Rongo has been found on just a few dozen wooden objects and tablets that have survived from Rapa Nui. Many of them are heavily weathered, burned, or otherwise damaged, and they were all plundered by private collectors in the 19th century, now scattered in museums and private collections around the world. Every modern attempt to decipher Rongo Rongo has failed, and the script stands as one of the true mysteries of Easter Island. Many of the glyphs that make up the script are representations of things the islanders saw around them. We can see the familiar shapes of sea turtles and birds, for instance. And I'll post images of these up on Twitter and Patreon for you to see. The legends of the islanders say that the original founder, the man they called Hotumatua, had brought the wooden tablets with him when he landed on Easter Island. But this seems unlikely. There is no known tradition of writing anywhere else in Polynesia, and so it's thought that Rongo Rongo must have been an invention of the islanders themselves. It doesn't seem like literacy was ever widespread. In fact, early visitors to the island were told that reading and writing was a privilege.
I think we
of
can
the
get a little
ruling
bit of
families
color in
and
here.
priests. And some have argued
Let's
Rongo
see.
Rongo must be a more modern invention, that the islanders may have seen Europeans reading and writing, thus inspiring them to create their own script. If this were the case, then the written language of Rongo Rongo would have emerged, flourished, and then fallen into oblivion, all within a space of less than 100 years. But I think one detail of the script makes me doubt this. That's the character that shows, clearly and unambiguously, the distinctive wine bottle shape of a Jubea palm tree, a species that went extinct on the island before the year 1650, more than 70 years before first European contact.
Oh, you know what? We're
To
gonna
my mind,
fix his
this alone
snout
shows that Rongo Rongo
first.
was developed on the island during
First?
a time
Well, okay,
when
we'll color him
giant
quick.
palms still towered over its shores. In 1864, a French churchman, Eugène Roux, arrived
Churchman?
on
What
the
is a
island
churchman?
and described seeing a vast number of these writing tablets, although it seemed to him
I can't believe
that
that's
the
a real term.
islanders no longer valued them as repositories of knowledge.
In every hut, one finds wooden tablets or sticks covered in several sorts of hieroglyphic characters. They are depictions of animals unknown on the island, which the natives draw with sharp stones. Each figure has its own name, but the scant attention they pay to these tablets leads me to think that these characters, remnants of some primitive writing, are now for them a habitual practice, which they keep without seeking its meaning.
European visitors in the following decades reported seeing the islanders using these writing tablets as reels for their fishing lines and as tools for fire starting. And by this time, none of the islanders could agree on how to read the tablets. Whatever knowledge was held in the Rongo Rongo script, the destruction of the island society had caused it to be lost. And if attempts at deciphering it continue to be unsuccessful, we may never know what the Rapa Nui people wrote down. This destruction occurred more than anything due to the final, tragic stage of the collapse of Rapa Nui society. And once again, it's not because they cut down the trees. By 1789, maps were being printed that showed exactly where Easter Island was. These maps meant that anyone with a ship could now make their way there, and for the remaining islanders, this would spell their doom. In the 19th century, the island became a common stop for ships that wanted to pick up food and supplies.
The
And more than 50
Crunchers.
recorded voyages are known to have stopped there. But the number of unrecorded visits may have been much higher, and as time went by, people's reasons for visiting the island began to become more sinister.
What could you mean?
In
Chat, what do you
1805,
think he means?
a ship full of American seal hunters found themselves short-handed. In need of labourers, they made landfall on Easter Island and kidnapped 22 Rapa Nui people, forcing them to work on their ship and keeping them in shackles below deck. When the men were finally taken up on deck, every last one of them jumped overboard into the sea and swam below the surface so the sealers couldn't recapture them.
Oh.
This would be only the beginning of increasingly organised slave-taking raids against the island. Soon, the Rapa Nui were understandably hostile
Wild
to any
guess.
foreigner who tried to land there. A Russian expedition.
Hey,
was
guys, it's
mounted
an
to
island of
Stone
just
in
free
the
guys.
1816, and
Oh,
traffic to the
yeah.
South Pacific was only to increase as whaling activity drove the North Atlantic whale populations to the edge of extinction.
I always choose the
Now
funnest
more whalers
podcasts for
ventured ever
for my
further
art
into the
streams, don't I?
South Pacific, and it was common for these ship crews to kidnap Rapa Nui men and women as slaves. These slave raids reached their peak in the 1860s, when large and well-equipped expeditions began arriving from Peru with weapons. These teams, known as blackbirders, would scour the whole island, searching through its caves and hollows, rounding up almost every single adult they could find. In total, these raids kidnapped over 1,500 of the Rapa Nui people.
Oh, don't worry, it gets worse too.
Only a scattered bunch of survivors who had managed to hide and were spared.
Ooh, that iced coffee's watery. Ooh.
With their work done, the sailors voyaged home to Peru, and the kidnapped Rapa Nui people were put to work on plantations or as domestic servants. When news of these kidnappings got out, there was a public outcry.
I appreciate that there's a
Campaign
public
began to
outcry.
repatriate the kidnapped islanders, headed by a French bishop. The Peruvian government was reluctant at first, but it was ultimately forced by international pressure to comply. The islanders were rounded up and transported back to the home they had been stolen from. But this only led to further tragedy. Of the 1,500 who had been taken, the vast majority had died in Peru, leaving less than 100 remaining. A further 85 died due to the harsh conditions on the voyage back to Easter Island, leaving only about a dozen survivors who ever made it home.
A dozen of what?
Of these,
1,500, he
some
said?
were infected with smallpox,
Ah.
and before long, this spread through the remaining population of the island. This devastating event would be the final death knell for the island's distinctive and beautiful culture. Among those taken as slaves were every single one of the priestly class, the only people on the planet who could read the Rongo Rongo script.
Why did I merge that
The
layer?
continuity
Very
of
goofy
songs
behavior
and
from
folk
me.
tales that had for centuries
Oh well.
carried
Too late.
the folk memory of the people of Rapa Nui was lost. By 1866, there were just 111 adult islanders living on Rapa Nui.
Let's see if the
68
liquefy tool
men
can't
and
fix this.
43 women.
Notice.
Of these, only 36 ever had any offspring,
Oop.
meaning that the current indigenous population of the island
Just gotta
is
reopen that,
descended
don't
from
mind that.
only these 36 people. 2 years later, in 1868,
Okay, we're good.
the HMS Topaz, a 51-gun British frigate of the Royal Navy, landed on Easter Island to find a devastated population. The islanders could no longer summon the energy even to throw stones at the arriving Europeans. The British searched the island until they found what they were looking for. It was the most beautiful example of a moai ever carved. This was one of the rare statues carved not from the soft volcanic tuff, but from hard basalt, meaning that its surface details and contours have been remarkably preserved. It must have been truly a labor of love for a team of ancient artists to carve this hard stone. The British put ropes around it and dragged it aboard their ship, while the helpless Rapa Nui watched. When a British sailor asked one of the islanders what the name of the statue was, they replied that he was Hoa Hakananaya. This translates to our stolen friend.
Ah.
The statue was eventually presented to Queen Victoria.
Eh.
It was placed in the British Museum,
Oh.
where it remains to this day.
Oh, really?
Despite repeated requests by the modern Rapa Nui for it to be returned.
Like, I love museums, and if I ever did go to England, I don't know why I would. I would want to check out the museums, but like I would have to wear like a t-shirt. It's like that one tweet of reading Mein Kampf on the subway but shaking my head so everybody knows I disapprove of it. I would have to be doing that the entire time. 'Cause, oh god, what an insult.
As a final death blow,
So I just won't go.
Rapa Nui was annexed by Chile.
I'll just
in
look at their like digital
1888.
scans of all their
And 12 years
artifacts.
later,
I don't know,
the
man.
whole island was bought to be used as a sheep ranch.
Yeah.
Capitalism arrived on Easter.
Capitalism.
The tiny population of remaining Rapa Nui were moved into the town of Hangaroa on the west coast. They were ordered to build a 9-foot stone wall around the town and were then told they were not allowed to go beyond this wall. Virtually the whole island was now off limits. to
I
them.
eat stolen cultural
The only
artifacts.
way for the Rapa Nui to survive was to work on the sheep ranch.
Yeah, it's
so that
rough.
They could earn wages
It's
and buy
rough.
food. But the only food they could buy was from a shop owned by their employer.
Ooh, we got company
They were
stores.
effectively imprisoned labourers on their own island. The island now became home to many thousands of sheep who grazed its slopes for more than 60 years. And this, more than anything the Rapa Nui had done, destroyed the last remaining trees and stripped the island of its topsoil. One American visitor to the island
Let's see if we can get some
company man named
post
William
processing effects on here.
recounted seeing the ecological damage that the intensive sheep farming had done to the island's ecology.
In other parts of the island may be seen in places in considerable numbers.
I like how this is just like a guy.
By the natives.
All the other ones were like, I'm British.
These must have flourished well at one time, but are now all, or nearly all, dead and decaying by reason of being stripped of their bark by the flocks of sheep, which roam at will all over the island.
Now the buried statues of Easter Island would stare out over the bleak and treeless landscape we have come
Yeah, you
to
found your pen?
recognize. So
Yeah,
different
the
to
Louvre's
the
rough.
rich, cultivated gardens of Rapa Nui. And so
It also
a clear
stinks in there,
picture of this collapse
because they built it
does
all with
begin
like
to emerge.
limestone, so it off gases a
And we
bunch
can
of
see that the
like
mystery
sulfur.
of Easter Island isn't much of a mystery at all.
It smells like
Rapa Nui
pooper.
wasn't the site of an ecological suicide, as we've been led to believe, but the site of a genocide. This unique and beautiful civilization did collapse, but it did so after contact with the outside world, and not before. The Easter Islanders didn't foolishly damage their environment and bring about their downfall. In fact, they made their island garden flourish. They built one of the most remarkable visual cultures in the world through ingenuity and hard work, and maintained peace on their island community. So when we reach for Easter Island as a fable or warning about our future, we should be very careful about what kind of fable we turn it into. As we move forward in facing the challenges of our own time, perhaps we should be asking not what warning we might take from the fate of Easter Island, but what its people may have to teach us. I want to end the episode by listening to a piece of music we've heard a few times already. It's an old piece of Rapa Nui folk music, performed by students at the Toki School of Music and Arts in Rapa Nui, which aims to preserve the traditional culture of the Easter Islanders for the next generation. It's the song that was once sung over the carving of the great Moai statues, and its rhythm comes from the striking together of two stones. As you listen, try to imagine what it must have been like for these islanders to watch their traditional way of life dissolve beneath the pressures of a cruel and unrelenting
Me when
outside
I'm a dog
world.
and I'm barking outside. I don't know if y'all can hear
Imagine
that,
what
but
it must have felt like to have your faith in the protective power of your ancestors shaken
bake.
as disaster after disaster seems to wash in like a summer
I think
storm
if the neighbors simply
sea.
let me pet their dog,
Imagine how they must
That
have
would be
felt
very cool.
standing on those grassy slopes and watching the sails of tall ships coming in over the horizon. As the Pacific wind blew over the rolling grassy slopes, still scattered with the lowering stone statues of a forgotten
the lighting isn't entirely accurate, but you know. That dog sounds like two stones smacking together.
Thank you for listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. I'd like to thank my voice actors for this episode, Jacob Rowlandson. Jacob
I would
Howard
not
Mills,
like to thank the voice actors. I think the
Kelly.
voice actors should go to hell. No, wait, I take it back. All right, let's find another sad story of a civilization falling. We can start on the Songhai Empire. It's a 2-hour episode though, so we'll be done by the time it wraps up. Ooh, big stretch.
In the year
Telling Gianni, no,
1858,
don't. Oh,
the German explorer
Please.
Heinrich Barth travelled across the wide expanse of the Sahara Desert.
hiccup.
He was determined to reach the city of Timbuktu that lay at its far edge. He spoke Arabic, along with several African languages, and made careful notes about the places he passed through. His journey all around West Africa would ultimately be a trip of nearly 20,000 kilometers. But Bart was always on the lookout for more sights to see, and on the arduous return leg of his journey, he heard rumors of something that only a handful of Europeans had ever seen before. His guides told him of the
Frizy.
existence of an enormous ruined city lost in the African bush. A city that had once commanded the continent's greatest empire. His guides called this city Gao.
As soon as I had made out that Gao was the place which for several centuries had been the capital of a strong and mighty empire in this region, I felt a more ardent desire to visit it than I had to reach Timbuktu. Gao had been the center of a great...
There is
national
one for the
movement
Inca episode,
from which powerful
Empire.
and
Here, let me
successful princes spread
let me just link to this podcast. It's a fantastic podcast, and he does like he first releases the podcast, and then he'll release a video that has some like associated imagery. I just listened to the Inca one, which I think is a 2-parter. My dad did a little bit of survey work in Peru, in Machu Picchu. Actually, he was a seismologist. So he spent some months there. Musica civilizations in North-South America. Has not done Musica. He's done Aztecs and Mayans, though.
their conquests.
I have not heard of that culture. I know
Bart
there's a lot.
gathered his things and
There's like
set
a
out,
lot.
following the Niger River along with his guides, through the swampy lowlands and flat desert plains, swatting away mosquitoes and tsetse flies, until he reached the site of the former city. But what he saw disappointed him. He found only a small collection of huts, about 300 in total, with heaps of overgrown rubble where the ancient city had once stood.
This once busy locality, which, according to the unanimous statements of former writers, was the most splendid city of Africa, is now the desolate abode of a small and miserable population. Just opposite my tent lay the ruined massive tower, the last remains of the principal mosque of the capital. All around the wide open area in which we were encamped was woven a rich corona of vegetation, among which, in the clear light of the morning, I discovered date palms, tamarind trees, sycamores, and silk cottons.
Not to be deterred, Bart explored the ruins of the ancient city and took detailed notes about what he saw.
The town, in its most flourishing period, seems to have had a circumference of about 6 miles. The east quarter of the mosque is entirely girded with a thick grove of siwak bushes, which covers all the uninhabited part of the former city. The mosque consisted originally of a low building flanked on the east and west side by a large tower, the whole courtyard being surrounded by a wall about 8 feet in height. The eastern tower is in ruins, but the western one is still tolerably well preserved. It rises in 7 terraces, which
Maybe I won't do
gradually
this
decrease
fact,
in
but
diameter.
let's try a little bit.
The inhabitants still offer their prayers in this sacred space where their great conqueror is interred.
You know what? That sounds
They
kind of
have
interesting.
not sufficient energy to repair the whole.
Maybe I'll do a
His guides told him that this had been the
funky
capital
version and then just
of
the
an empire
normal
known
version without
as
the funny filter.
Songhai. Bart soon left the ruins of Gao to the silk cottons and sycamore trees and continued on his journey home. But the sight of the ruined city seems to have stuck with him, and wherever he went, he would ask the same questions. How had the empire of Songhai grown to such size in the harsh desert landscape of the southern Sahara? How had its people held such a society
I just got jump
together
scared.
and built such grand constructions? And why,
Free from the
after rising
clutches
to
of
such
employment
great
at
heights,
last.
had they left it all here to crumble into the dust and shifting dunes of
Alrighty.
the desert?
Well, Vox, I think I'm gonna give you two versions. One with the orange cast and one with the blue cast. But give it a quick once over. And if I can change anything right now, we got 3 minutes left. No pressure. Neat. Nice. Yeah, go to bed. Have a nice sleep.
My name's Paul Cooper,
Good
and you're
evening.
listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast.
Oh yeah, the birds. Okay,
Every episode,
are
I
the
look-
birds in the game, or I've not played Hyperdemon yet. Birds in okay, they do exist. Oh, there they. Oh my God, they're so cute. Okay, we can get birds in. We got time for birds. Yeah. Oh my God, they're adorable. Beep 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 beep. Oh, and now we have a bunch of stupid prompt hunt and AI art below that. Oh my God, annoying. There's the effect. Okay. Okay, I had seen these in screenshots, but they're like so like chromatically aberrated that I couldn't tell that they were birds. Excellent. We can get a couple little peepers.
at a civilization of the past that rose
We
to
can put
glory
more than 3 minutes
and then
into the birds. We got
collapsed
some
into the
time
ashes
here.
of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their
I don't know how to
fall?
draw birds. Hold up.
And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time, who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode, I want to look at a society that has been all but forgotten by popular narratives of history, the Songhai people of West Africa. I want to explore how this great civilization rose up among some of the harshest conditions our planet can throw at us, how they united two warring traditions, became a cosmopolitan and pluralistic society, as well as Africa's greatest empire. And I want to explain why, after barely more than a century of greatness, their whole society collapsed around them.
Oop.
This will be an episode about cycles. And our first cycle is that of the planet Earth itself. As the Earth spins through the dark void of space, it turns on its axis, giving us the cycle of night and day. But there's another planetary cycle that affects us all just as profoundly, although it is much, much slower. This is the wobble of the Earth, known more scientifically as its axial precession. This wobble is caused by the gentle gravitational tug of the other planets in our solar system, and it changes the angle of the planet's tilt by about 1 degree every 72 years, until it tilts a full 23 degrees each way. This cycle lasts for over 25,000 years, and this tilt can have some extreme effects on the climate on the planet's surface. Over the last 8,000 years or so, one of these effects has been to shift the pattern of monsoon rains on the African continent, pushing them southward and creating an enormous dry zone in its northern region. This has created one of Earth's most impressive geographic features, the Sahara Desert. The Sahara is a vast ocean of sand dunes, rock plateaus, and salt flats that covers an area totaling 9 million square kilometers. This desert makes up around 30% of the entire African continent. But until about 5,000 years ago, these bare sand dunes were rolling green grasslands. The landscape was broken by rivers and huge lakes that supported late Stone Age human
smart.
communities.
I remember
Sparse
learning that trick back in
forests
grade
grew here,
5.
full of oak and
I
walnut,
never thought it actually
and
worked,
olive trees.
but I'm gonna try that from now on.
Rock paintings have even been discovered in the Central Sahara that date to around the year 3000 BC
That's maybe too
and
many
depict
lines.
lush vegetation and abundant animals in areas
I
where
really
today
like that
there's
effect.
nothing but desert.
On the birds, that looks really cool.
But as the planet tilted on its endless cycle, this landscape's days were numbered. The rains gradually left the region. The large plant life would have died off first, until only grasses remained. And then eventually, the grass too would have died.
No, my grass.
Without plant cover to absorb the heat of the sun, or roots to hold together the earth, the topsoil would have dried up and blown away in the wind. Slowly, these green valleys turned into arid grasslands, then to desert, and finally to the enormous Sahara that we know today.
I really don't know how to draw
Neolithic
songbirds. Oh
people
my god.
fled from the steady advance of this great desert.
Ah, how can it be? They're little
It drove
sausages.
them out of the Sahara and concentrated them at its edges.
They're funny little guys.
Some of them fled to the northeast and settled in the fertile Nile Valley, where they would lay the foundation for the civilization of the pharaohs.
Oh, the
But
who?
others went south and built a civilization of their own. Much of this story will take place in a landscape just to the south of the Sahara, known today as the Sahel. The word derives from the Arabic sahil, which means coast or shore. That's because early people thought of the place as the coast of the great sea of sand that stretches for nearly 2,000 kilometers until it meets the Mediterranean. The Sahel is a zone of transition. It's neither the desert sand to the north, nor the tropical savanna to the south. For most of its 5,000-kilometer length, from the Red Sea to the Atlantic coast, it's a landscape of semi-arid grasslands and steppes, broken by thorn scrubland and patches of acacia trees. Much of the life here relies on regular monsoon rains. During the long dry season, many trees here lose their leaves, and the annual grasses die away. Several species of gazelle and buffalo compete here with large predators like the cheetah and lion, along with the African wild dog. But there are also spots of incredible richness
I
in
know
this
they're cool.
otherwise
Canid.
arid landscape.
Those wild dogs are sick as
And the
hell.
source of this richness can be seen from outer space. From its source, in the mountainous highlands of southeastern Guinea, West Africa's longest river runs inland for over 4,000 kilometers in a dramatic, sweeping sickle shape. This is the Niger River. Its name is thought to come from the Berber phrase Jer and Jer, meaning river of rivers. The Niger River is exceptionally fertile.
Whoa.
At
I'm
its
gonna have to
deepest
get him to
point,
stop
it is
saying
nearly
fertile.
a kilometer across, and it floods every year across a vast area that turns the desert green. In fact, its cultivation zone is more than 5 times the size of the one surrounding Egypt's Nile River, allowing the people who live here to grow rice, millet, and couscous for half of the year.
Couscous is a
The
pasta,
medieval
it's not a
West
grain.
African chronicle, known as the Tarikh el-Fatash, paints a glowing picture
Unless
of the
there's a
wealth
type of
and beauty
couscous
of
that
this region.
originated as a grain and then the pasta is named after it. I wonder if
Mali
that's the case.
encompasses
We're
a
gonna look it up.
region of 400 towns, and its soil is extremely rich.
Ancient alien structures
Among
beneath the center of
kingdoms
Sahara
the sovereigns of
confirmed.
the world,
I
only
fucking
the
knew
lands
it.
of Syria surpass it in its beauty. Its inhabitants are rich
I'm
and
for some
live very
frickin'
well.
couscous right now. Holy shit.
According to oral tradition,
Yeah.
the story of human settlement along the Niger River begins with a people known as the Sorko.
Yeah, okay, so you can cook pearl
They
millet,
built
sorghum, and
settlements
bulgur.
along the riverbank and fashioned boats
Similar to how
from
you'd cook
African
couscous,
mahogany.
and so they just call it couscous.
They were soon joined by a people known as the Gao, skilled hunters who knew how to
Don't
bring
fear the
down
alien, fear the
hippopotamus
orb.
and even crocodiles.
Me
living
when
in the
there's
river.
a orb.
These were joined
I had
by
a
the
watermelon last
who had
yesterday
adapted to
afternoon
life
that was
cultivating
quite
crops in the river
fertile.
floodplains. Finally, a hardy people from the north moved into the region. They were the first to ride horses here, and they called themselves the Songhai. From the very beginning, this was a blended society that survived by unifying formerly disparate elements into a successful whole. The riverboats of the Sorko, the hunting skills of the Yao, and the Doe's farming acumen, all supercharged with the power of the horse, all combined to form the beginning of a complex and connected society that would forever use the River Niger as its lifeblood. But their journey from these humble beginnings would not be easy or straightforward.
Yeah.
Over recorded history, a number of great empires rose up in West Africa. And I think we should pause for a moment and ask, what is an empire?
What is an empire?
An empire is a violent phenomenon.
Oh.
It occurs when one kingdom
yeah,
or
okay.
state becomes more powerful than its neighbor.
All right. Aside, if you have
It
any
then
more,
invades and
or if there's any more things I can fill in, let me know. I'm just gonna put my signature down here. A little, okay, not that obvious. Let's make it a little bit more subtle. What year is it? Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Multinational centralized power structure. That seems like a pretty good definition.
conquers them and rules
All
over
right, I'm
both
going to save that.
territories by
Just have it on the
force.
side. And actually, I'm just
The
going to
original
BRB
nation,
for a bathroom break,
what's
but I'm going to
known as
leave you
the
guys
imperial
with
center, will usually extract
the fall of
resources
civilizations.
and
1
wealth
second.
from their conquered subject. And it may also make some attempt to impose its culture and way of life on them. Empires grow in this way, absorbing neighbors and turning them into so-called client states. They become more powerful, but they also, as is usually the case, grow more unstable. And then, eventually, the bubble bursts. Whether through poor leadership, economic collapse, or imperial overreach, the empire falters and weakens. The client states demand their freedom. The power that held the imperial center together fails, and the whole edifice cracks like an eggshell. This is often a time of great unrest. The once mighty capital city might even go down in flames. But for its most powerful client states, the lack of central authority might represent an opportunity. They might begin to expand their own territory. They might build an empire of their own. There are many theories about how exactly empires grow and operate, but this simplified account is what has been called the imperial cycle. And I think it's useful to think about this when we look at the history of West Africa. Some empires of this region will follow this cycle exactly, while others will try, with limited success, to break it. The first empire to grow here was the Empire of Ghana. It rose up on the fringes of the Sahara Desert around the 8th century. Its people pioneered ironworking in the region, giving them a military edge. And it's clear that by the year 1000, Ghana had conquered a large number of client states at its borders
The return.
and begun to build a true empire.
Hyberdemon sounds
And the
really
secret
cool.
to
If it's
Ghana's
anything like Devil
success
Daggers,
relied on
which I
one
guess it
thing that
must
would
be.
prove essential to all the empires that would
I gotta
follow
get that.
after. And actually, it's not a thing.
All right, the next one is, let me just Well, this one is a gift, but I don't know if I can share whoever commissioned it. But this is for a friend of the show who also got a commission a little while back, but this is a gift for them. See if we'll be able to recognize them as we work on it. I mean, their username is literally right at the top of my little file list there, but I just need to get a photo reference for this one. I have not chosen it yet. All right, podcast.
Animal. Until around the year 300, horses were the main mode of transportation in West Africa. And a horse, while strong and fast on hard ground, is poorly
More
suited
daggers. How could you have
to harsh
more
environment
daggers?
and shifting sands
Lasers,
of the
photo
desert.
stimulation. Oh yeah.
In July and August, daytime
Okay, so
temperatures in the
it's
Sahara
it's the
reach 50
epileptic
degrees
killer.
centigrade, or over
That's sick.
120 degrees Fahrenheit. And the desert is also prone to sandstorms. The most deadly of these is known as the simoom, or poison wind. These hot, dry winds reach temperatures of up to 54 degrees centigrade, or over 130 Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to scald the skin. These simooms are known to cause rapid onset heat stroke in desert travelers, since they can transfer
buddy Trevor.
more heat to the human body than it's possible to lose through the evaporation of sweat. This causes the body to quickly overheat,
Reference photos, reference
and
photos,
major
reference
organs
photos.
begin to fail. But from the 4th century onwards, a remarkable new innovation began arriving from Arabia. It was an animal with large, flat feet and adaptations that made them
Camel!
for survival in the heat.
Sorry, I get excited over
Among
camels.
these was the distinctive hump on their back.
Oh,
The camel had arrived in West Africa.
yeah!
The introduction of camels transformed the economy of the Sahara. They could carry enormous weights of up to 150 kilograms. And this meant that large-scale trade was now possible across the desert. The West African economy at this time was already flourishing, but now it was suddenly linked up to the rich markets of the Mediterranean. And the result was the beginning of a new era for both peoples.
Okay, we're using a muscle mommy for a reference picture here.
Trade across the Sahara relied on a system of caravans, which were vast trains of camels piled high with goods and luxuries.
This was a freestyle.
According to the 14th century
Pose.
Arab writer Ibn Battuta, the average size of these
Literally
caravans
so cool.
was around 1,000 camels, but they could grow as large as 12,000. They would have been an incredible sight.
Like using this like
snaking across
amazing
the red
like
sands of the desert for
statuesque muscle
miles.
mommy for like a little gremlin.
There were 3 main routes across the central
Excellent.
Sahara through most of its history. And
It's
they
for mix.
zigzagged between oases in the desert.
What are the reviews
An
like?
oasis was a spot where an aquifer
Oh, this
or
game
an
makes me
underground
want to
river,
grill myself.
often coupled with a layer of impermeable rock below the sand, caused fresh water to appear on the surface of the desert. Over millennia, humans settled on these oases, and in these small pockets, they reversed the process that led the Sahara to form in the first place.
No, we gotta do
They
foreshortening.
first
No,
planted
wait.
groves of hardy date palms that then provided shade for smaller trees like apricots, figs, and olives. These oases formed crucial stopping points along the trade routes over the desert. They were so important that military control of these tiny settlements could often mean control
Could also
over an
just do
entire
something very
trade route
cute, like a
and
collection
all
of
its
cute
accompanying
sketches.
wealth. Today, traveling at high speed in a modern car, these trade routes would represent a non-stop
I'm gonna sketch out
drive
this figure
of
and
over
then decide.
70 hours. But for travelers in the Middle Ages, with their vast herds of camel, it took roughly 2
You know what? The
months
hour is
to
paid
cross
for,
the
and if I
desert.
go a little bit over, that's okay.
These journeys were so long.
I think I
that
wanna do
about
some
a
cute
third
stuff.
of the camels on the caravan
I'm
were
just gonna
there
say it. I want her
simply
to slice me
carry
with that sword.
supplies
So
for
do
the journey.
I. Very
and in
real.
these conditions, even the camels struggled. After their journeys, the animals
Okay, I know.
had to spend months recuperating. A 4-month round trip would usually earn them an 8-month rest afterwards. The kingdoms of West Africa used these desert trails to transport ivory, spices, wheat, and exotic animals to Europe, as well as a steady trade in slaves.
We'll do a little sketch page here.
The transatlantic slave trade that we're all familiar with
Oh,
in
what?
history books shipped millions of African slaves to the Americas over roughly 400 years. It was exceptional in its scale and brutality, but it wasn't the beginning of slavery. In fact, forms of slavery have existed probably since the beginning of agricultural society. Ancient Rome, Greece, and Carthage were all famously slave societies. And with the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe and its ensuing chaos, slave-taking only increased. But with the gradual Christianization of Europe in the first millennium, the Church began to introduce rules about keeping other Christians as slaves. By the year 1000, slavery of Christians by Christians had more or less ended in feudal Europe, although it's worth mentioning that it was replaced by the widespread system of serfdom, where peasant workers
Yeah, it's just
were
slavery with
little
extra
better than
steps.
slaves and could still be bought and sold by feudal lords. But the keeping of non-Christian slaves was still allowed, and persisted right through the Middle Ages. When Christian kingdoms went to war with the kingdoms of the Muslim world, prisoners of war were constantly being taken as slaves by both sides. But for both Muslims and Christians, sub-Saharan Africa was the source of a seemingly infinite supply of forced laborers. Since the first trade routes across the Sahara began, the lands of the north began extracting Africa's manpower by force. These slaves were transported across the desert under horrendous conditions, and were sold in the slave markets of North Africa, in the Byzantine Empire, and in Venice and Spain. They were often used as laborers and servants, but they were also forced to fight as soldiers in one medieval army or another. And while slavery is deeply unpleasant to consider, it was an unfortunate fact of life in this time, and it will be important to acknowledge its effect on the history of this region if we are to make any sense at all of what happens next. More valuable than slave laborers, ivory, or spices was the natural resource that occurred in West Africa with an abundance unparalleled around the known world.
Gold?
And that resource was gold.
Ah, got it. I'm like a history genius. I just
Gold
know
has
history. I
always
don't even
done
have to read any
something
books.
strange
I can just
to the
make it up.
human brain. Something about its warm color and reflective surface has always made us desire it. We want to wear it on our bodies and decorate our buildings with it,
Okay.
and we've structured entire economies around it. This rare, precious metal, more than any other, has always suggested to us a kind of divinity. The ancient Egyptians called gold the breath of God, while the Aztecs called it the sweat of the sun.
Oh,
And these early ideas of
I
gold
kinda like the
as a
Aztec
metal
one
sent
more.
from heaven are actually not that far from the truth.
the imagery is even better.
Like most heavy metals, gold was forged in the center of stars by the process of nuclear fusion. Stars, just like empires, pass through a cycle. They grow and grow until they reach the size that we call a supergiant, thousands of times larger than our own sun. After this, it enters into a death spiral. Most stars simply shed their outer layers and fizzle out, but some, perhaps less than 1%, achieve a mass that means they explode in a supernova, a burst of energy and light that can be equivalent for a few moments to the brightness of an entire galaxy. And it's in these explosions that gold is formed. From around 200 million years after our planet first formed,
Cover me in
gold
sun
started
sweat,
raining
Sky
from the
Daddy.
sky, carried on asteroids that bombarded the Earth's surface.
That
West
is now
Africa
permanently etched into
is
my brain.
remarkably rich in
I'm
this
gonna,
rare
every
element.
time I'm like outside and like warm,
In
I'm gonna
fact,
be like, hey, did you
until
guys
the
know
discovery
that?
of the Americas in the 16th century, this region was the world's top producer of gold.
Gold.
So much gold left Africa during this time that Europeans and Arabs began to believe that it must be home to a single monumental gold mine, a mountain of gold that was being intentionally kept a secret by African kings. This idea would later
wishful
inspire
thinking.
myths like the story of King Solomon's mines. But actually, the reality was quite the opposite. Gold in West Africa wasn't mined from a single source, but from countless tiny gold mines and panning stations across the land. Gold usually occurs in flecks and nuggets, found within quartz crystals. Over time, the crystals are eroded by the running water of rivers and streams, and the flecks of gold run free. The majority of West Africa's gold wasn't dug out of a mine, but panned on the banks of the Senegal and Niger rivers. And the extremely variable climate of the region also helped this industry. That's because during the long dry season, when all plant life died and agriculture was impossible, many farmers would hang up their farm tools and go prospecting for gold instead. The 10th century Iranian geographer Ibn al-Faqih seems to have heard some version of this process, as he relates in his geography text, the Book of Lands.
Yeah, but where's uranium stored?
In Africa, gold grows in,
In the
sand
balls.
like carrots do, and is picked at
And
sunrise.
fatty tissues, I presume.
These part-time prospectors would gather together their tiny amounts of gold dust and wait for the trading caravans to pass through. Due to the great variety of languages
In my
used
balls.
in this
That's
part
where
of
we're
the
mining
world,
all of uranium.
these
We're going
traders
straight for
would
your
often
balls.
engage in a practice known as silent barter. They would lay out their goods on rugs, ornaments and tools, foods, spices, and most importantly salt, which is hard to come by in sub-Saharan Africa and was crucial for preserving food. The traders would then beat on large drums and blow trumpets and withdraw out of sight. The local amateur gold miners would emerge and place their little nuggets and flecks of gold in front of the goods they wanted, offering what they thought they were worth. The
Interesting.
traders would then return, and if they accepted the price, they would take the gold. They would then travel north and exchange it with North African traders, who would give them more salt and exotic Mediterranean goods in return.
Me holding my
Soon,
schnutz.
a veritable
Power of the
river
sun in
of
the palm
gold
of my hand.
flowed north across the desert. And through this system, the early kingdoms of West Africa swelled to eye-watering wealth. To give you a sense of the kind of wealth we're talking about, it's worth looking at the example of one of Africa's most famous
I want him,
medieval
okay,
kings.
intrusive thought. I want him to say, like, he was the Donald
His
Trump
name
of his
has
time.
gone down in history as Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in the world.
The Elon Musk of his time. Oh, I would throw up immediately.
The Empire of Ghana,
Nah, he wouldn't do
which
it
had
to
ruled
us. This
much of West Africa
this
for
historian's a
500
classy
years,
guy.
went into decline at some point during the 13th century. It passed through the final stages of that imperial cycle we talked about. Its power weakened, its client states demanded independence, and finally, one of its own conquered subjects eclipsed it in power, snapping up its old dominions and seizing control of the lucrative Saharan trade routes.
Me when I seize control of
This
the
was
lucrative
the beginning of a new empire.
Saharan trade routes.
Eventually, even the Ghanaian kingdom was absorbed into this rising power, and it would become known as the Empire of Mali. The Mali Empire inherited much of the wealth
The
and
Jeffrey
power
Epstein of
its
his time.
predecessor, but it developed the system of trans-Saharan trade to eye-watering size. Its most famous king, Mansa Musa, was a genius.
The core
of
is ball
public
shaped. The
relations.
core is kept warm by the decay of
He was so
radioactive
famous
elements. So
that he
yeah,
even
the
appeared
warmest
on a
testicles
medieval
on the
European
Earth
map
is the
known as
Earth.
the Catalan Atlas,
And
holding
pressure,
a gold
right, yeah.
coin and wearing a gold crown.
Not quite a bongo cat.
Mansa
They're going to be
Musa's
scared of
journey
a toast.
To become the king of
But
Mali
I think this is going to be
is
like a
probably
cat
one of the
cat
strangest
mode
stories of royal
sketch page for
succession
Mix.
in history. The year was 1312. Musa was an elite member of the Mali court, serving an eccentric old king named Abu Bakr II.
That's a bad toaster.
Musa was around the age of 32 when he was summoned to see the king. The king told him that Musa would be appointed as deputy and rule in the king's place while he was away. This was a common enough event, as kings who went off on campaign or pilgrimage would often appoint deputies to rule in their place. But it's where the king was going that must have raised at least a few eyebrows. Towards the end of his reign, the old king Abu Bakr became convinced that it would be possible to sail far enough across the Atlantic Ocean that he might reach the other side. In fact, he became obsessed with this idea. The Arab historian Shihab al-Umari once spoke to Mansa Musa and recounts the king's version of what happened next.
The ruler before me believed that it was possible to reach the end of the ocean that encircles the earth. So he equipped 200 boats full of men and God, water and food enough for several years. He ordered the admiral not to return until they reached the end of the ocean.
Okay.
They set out. Their absence extended over a long period of time, and at last only one boat returned.
The sailors on this
I'm scared
boat
of toast.
brought back a tale
Great
of a
Columbo
great
line.
whirlpool that
Single
had sucked
slice
the fleet
toaster.
down
Yeah.
beneath the waves, leaving only their vessel
Oh shit!
afloat.
Look, I put a single slice, but I have two slices
Most
in the sketch.
likely,
God.
the fleet was wrecked during an Atlantic storm. But this whirlpool may have also been the formidable Canary Current that flows down the African continent.
Canary Current sounds like a
But
push.
the king Abu Bakr was not deterred, and he seems to have decided that if you want a job done, you should do it yourself.
Based king actually doing it himself?
This time he ordered 2,000 boats to be equipped for him and for his men, and 1,000 more for water and food. Then he departed with his men on the ocean trip, never to return.
This story has long fascinated
has to be perfect.
historians of West Africa. Of course, Abu Bakr would be proved right by history. Other lands really did lie beyond the ocean, and with the passage of only a few centuries, the fate of Africa would become inextricably tied to those lands. Some historians have slightly fancifully searched for evidence that Abu Bakr II may have actually reached the New World nearly 200 years before Columbus, but there is no real evidence for this. What's more, the only account we have of this story was the one given by the new king Mansa Musa. And as
He
we'll
very
find
well
out
could have been
later,
full of shit.
Kings can often be a little cagey about how exactly their predecessors met their ends. Still, the storyteller in me finds it an irresistible anecdote to mention, and something about the pure weirdness of it does tempt me to believe it. That this immensely wealthy king, not satisfied with the things of this world, sailed out into the ocean on an impossible quest, and drowned somewhere on his way to a new one. Whatever the circumstances of his rise to power, we do know that Musa was a fearsomely effective ruler. During his reign, he expanded the Mali Empire and conquered a further 24 cities, folding them into the largest empire that Africa had ever seen. But one event would secure his place in history. It will show the talent he had for self-promotion and would ensure that his name was on the lips
Self-promotion.
of Europeans and Arabs for centuries to come. And that was his eye-wateringly expensive pilgrimage to Mecca. As is always the case, it's not just goods that flow up and down trade routes. Human cultures also travel along them too. And with the increasing traffic of trade across the Sahara, West Africa was slowly being introduced to new and exotic ways of life. Chief among these foreign imports was the Arab culture, and along with it, the young religion of Islam. For the early kings of Mali, converting to Islam was an entry point into the world of the Mediterranean coast. It was a way to gain acceptance and influence among these various
Toaster head.
powerful kingdoms.
You might not be able to share the link,
The
but you can
first
share it
Malian
to
king
my
we
Twitter.
can reliably say was a Muslim was named Sundiata Keita, and he ruled in the first half.
Thermo,
of
you
the
have like a
13th
screen,
century,
a screen face,
nearly
though.
100
See,
years before Musa. But religion would always form a fracture that ran the whole length
Yeah.
of West African society,
Listen,
dividing the rich from the
screen,
poor,
screen face
and city
characters are
dwellers
all
from the
related
countryside.
and cool.
The people
Sonic
living
ass
in the
eyes.
farms and villages of West Africa,
You Sonic
the
ass
people
eyes,
who
Hatter.
worked the land and herded the cattle, were what we call animists. That means, loosely speaking, that they worshipped their ancestors, alongside the ancient spirits of nature and the magic that lived in the mountaintops and the forests. The Muslim chronicles record these kinds of beliefs with barely concealed contempt.
They worship idols among trees and stones, and make sacrifices to them and pray to them for their needs. Among these people are diviners and sorcerers.
What a bunch of
But in the
dorks, they
cities,
say.
Islam was the dominant religion, at least in name. For a West African citizen of this time, becoming a Muslim had a number of benefits. It helped you to build a rapport and trade with the foreigners who arrived from across the desert, and at times it allowed people to avoid certain taxes. And it also shielded people from the increasingly bold slave-taking raiders who came down from the Sahara. Just like in Christian Europe, under Islamic law, it was illegal for a Muslim to take another Muslim as a slave.
I love that all
This
these
prohibition
religions have like
was
a
taken
little
very
loophole in it, though. They're
seriously.
like, if they're a different
The
religion,
14th
though, it's
century
okay.
Islamic scholar Makhluf al-Balbali was one of the first to set this law in writing.
Yeah,
Anyone who is
just
known to
more.
be from those lands, which are known to be the lands of Islam, and who mentions he is from those lands, should be let go, and should be adjudged free. This was the ruling of the jurists of Andalusia.
Legal disputes would even erupt periodically over whether it was allowed to sell slaves who had converted after being captured. And for the Kingdom of Mali as a whole, converting to Islam offered similar protections. Again, similar to Christian Europe, Muslim kings were only supposed to go to war when it was legally sanctioned. A legal war of this kind was known as a jihad, or holy struggle. Legal approval would rarely be given for a war against another Muslim nation. By the time Mansa Musa took the throne, Mali had been a Muslim empire for over 100 years. But Musa was a devout Muslim and would go on to forge strong and enduring links with the rest of the Muslim world. He finally made a pilgrimage to Mecca that began in the year 1324. But even on this religious duty, Musa seems to have had a keen eye for his image.
He's a little
He
extra.
reportedly travelled with an impressive retinue that caused a sensation across the medieval world. He was accompanied by a caravan consisting of 60,000 men, including a personal retinue of 12,000 slaves, all carrying golden staffs and wearing brocade and Persian silk. He's also supposed to have travelled with a baggage train of 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold. At today's market rates, that would be a value of around 500 million or $500 million. At every city he stopped at, Mansa Musa handed out this gold to the poor in huge amounts. But his generosity had a number of inadvertent effects. All along his pilgrimage route, he left economic chaos in his wake. In the cities of Cairo, Medina, and Mecca that he passed through, the sudden influx of gold caused a collapse in the metal's value for the next decade, causing enormous inflation and devastating their economies.
Oop.
On
Economy
his way
isn't
home,
real.
perhaps a little bashful at the devastation he had caused, Musa loaned back all the gold he could find in Egypt in an attempt to somewhat stabilize the price.
The baby! Oh my god,
It's
this is
the
really
first
cute.
and last time in history that one man has controlled the price of
The
all
cute
the
baby.
world's gold. But the Empire of Mali, while
Chunku.
incredibly wealthy, wasn't to last.
Mm.
It would soon follow Ghana's footsteps along that imperial cycle. And one of its client states, which was only just beginning to flex its muscles, would soon become the true subject of this episode, and the largest empire in African history. And that state, finally, was the Kingdom of Songhai.
We got there, folks. I don't have to draw hands well, right? No, I don't have to draw hands well.
I think this is a good point to mention that there are essentially three groups of sources about the history of this region of West Africa, and they can often give wildly divergent versions of events. The first source is the Arab travelers and historians who occasionally crossed the Sahara and wrote about what they saw. Of these, two stand out for the length and detail of their descriptions. One of these is the traveller Ibn Battuta. He was the Moroccan Marco Polo. Over a period of 30 years in the 14th century, he travelled all over the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, then through Afghanistan and Central Asia, India and Sri Lanka, and even on to China. And it's on one of these great journeys that he explored the kingdoms of West Africa during the time of the Mali Empire. Nearly 2 centuries later, in the early 16th century, another traveller, a Spanish Moor who would become known as Leo Africanus, travelled in West Africa. Afterwards, he was captured by European pirates and taken to Rome, where he was forced to convert to Christianity. And there, he wrote down accounts of all his travels. But visitors of this kind are few and far between.
Just keep taking free
Each
guys.
one
Damn.
acts like a kind of snapshot, capturing a
Oh, you're
moment
doing
in
something
time.
else? No, you're coming to Rome,
And they
bitch.
can sometimes be frustratingly vague about the kinds of things that are interesting to a modern historian. The second source of information is the storytelling tradition of West Africa itself. This region is home to a unique tradition of folklore, presided over by a mysterious caste of mystics and holy men known as the griots.
Mysterious
For millennia,
cast of mystics.
These griots have played the roles of storyteller,
I don't know if I would have read that.
historian, singer, poet, and musician all together in West African society. These griots were repositories of an oral tradition, memorizing their stories and histories and passing them on from one generation to another. They were treated as wise men and magicians too, and often held positions as advisors to the kings and rulers. You're currently listening to a pair of griots from the town of Yelekela in modern Mali, still practicing this ancient tradition today. Like most of the world's folklore traditions, the stories of the griots were often not written down until the 19th century. Between different regions today, the stories of griots can differ greatly, and while they are an invaluable piece of cultural heritage, as a historian, they can often prove a frustrating source of information. To the griots, the boundary between history and myth is very thin. Their histories include fantastical stories, full of sorcerers and magic. But they are an incredible source for learning about how the people of this
Yeah, and all
region
that stuff is
perceive
real, so
their
what's the
own
problem?
history. And studies of their folklore have been used comparatively to corroborate or strengthen other sources. The final source is a kind of mixture of these two traditions, and that's the scribes of Timbuktu. We'll talk much more about Timbuktu later, but for now I'll only say that it was a library city on the edge of the desert.
Cool.
It was home to a serious scholarly tradition where scribes and learned men were trained. They were connected to an international network of intellectuals, which stretched from the libraries of Baghdad and Alexandria to the mosques of Cordoba in Spain. The scribes of Timbuktu were genuinely interested in recording history. Some of them even travelled with West African kings, with the express purpose of writing down the events they saw. Two of the most prominent works by these scribes are known as the Timbuktu Chronicles. They are the Tarikh al-Fatash and the Tarikh
Oh my god,
al-Safar,
Smilebong is so good.
the Chronicle of the
Yeah, I
Sea
saw that.
and the Chronicle of Africa.
Magnificent.
And you'll hear a lot more from both throughout this episode. Although many of the scholarly families of Timbuktu traced their lineage back to Arab Muslims, many of them were also West African, and they were steeped in the ancient traditions and folklore of the people around them. Although they liked to pretend that they weren't immune from the influence of the griots, those magical storytellers, and this comes through in the histories of the Timbuktu Chronicles, which are full of prophecies and dream visions, magical stories where men can turn into animals and kings can talk with demons. The Tarikh al-Fatash, for instance, recounts one origin story for the Songhai people. It relates how they were once ruled by a king who was half fish and half man, who every night swam up the Niger River and terrorized his subjects. Finally,
Fuck you guys.
overthrows
I'm a
the
fish man.
and becomes the Songhai's first king.
What the fuck?
But the scribe of the
That's what the guy
Chronicles
said.
relates some of these stories with a slight sense of
Oh,
embarrassment,
come on, Photoshop.
and even includes
Come back.
this anxious disclaimer.
Alright, we're good.
Most of the tales we have recounted are almost certainly not true. We ask forgiveness from God the Most High.
Another
Just
thing
to
to
cover our
mention
asses,
is that
God.
both these
It's
chronicles
bullshit. It's all
were also
bullshit. We're just
political
telling it.
documents. They
It's
were
an
written on the orders of
anthropological
kings,
note.
so they often massage history into a shape that casts these kings in the most flattering light. But if we apply their accounts cautiously, overlapping them both and placing them in conversation with other sources, they are also invaluable
It's a
for
cave.
learning about what
I don't know what I was
happened
going
during
for
this
with
time.
it. I was like, little texture.
So these are the sources we have to rely on. The fragmentary, unreliable accounts of Arab travelers in the region, the griot storytellers who still spin tales of the ancient times, and the scribes of Timbuktu, desperately trying to make sense of it all, with a king breathing over their shoulder. Because of the naturally unreliable nature of all of these sources,
You guys
the
sure
history
you're
of
not
this region
saying any
is filled
heretic
with many
stuff?
gaps and blank
You guys
spaces,
absolutely sure?
many
Just breathing over
questions
your
and
shoulder the whole time? Oh, wrong
uncertainties
there.
that I will attempt to navigate as we go forwards. The earliest written records mentioning the kingdom of Songhai appear in the 10th century. They mention a small kingdom on the banks of the Niger River, and for much of its history, that's all it was. Songhai centered around the city of Gao, a great trading terminus where the expanse of the Sahara met the green floodplain of the Niger. Just outside of Gao, a great sand dune looms over the skyline. It's known as the Rose Dune, due to the reddish color it turns at sunrise. And since ancient times, it has been thought to be the home of sorcerers, who are supposed to meet there after dark to perform their rituals and spells. And despite Islam being officially adopted by the royal court of Songhai as early as the year 1019, the city of Gao would always retain something of that character. More than perhaps any other city in the region, it still retained a deep-seated connection to the ancient ways of Africa. Gao was a
Still
great
says he's drunk.
cosmopolitan
No!
marketplace where African cola nuts, gold, ivory, slaves, spices, palm oil, and precious woods
Thank you.
were traded for Mediterranean
Oh.
goods, like salt, textiles, weapons, horses, and the metal copper. Gao was what's known as an entrepot, or entry port, the terminus of a vast array of trade routes which spread out from it like a web. The explorer Leo Africanus, who visited Gao in the 16th century, writes about the rich trade he saw arriving from Europe.
It is a wonder to see the quality of merchandise that is daily brought here, and how costly and sumptuous everything is. Horses purchased in Europe for 10 ducats are sold here for 40 and sometimes 50 ducats apiece.
Whoa.
There is not European cloth so coarse as to sell for less than 4 ducats per cubit. A cubit of the scarlet of Venice, or of Turkish cloth, is here worth 30 ducats. A sword is here valued at 3 or 4 crowns, and likewise are spears, bridles and similar commodities, and spices are all sold at a high rate. However, of all other items, salt is the most expensive.
While gold was universally used for trade, there was also another type of currency that was widespread in this region. These were cowrie shells.
Oh, thank God.
The shells of a type
I
of
thought they were
sea
gonna be
snail
like
that
human
occurs most
flesh.
commonly in the Indian Ocean. These small shells served much the same purpose as gold. They were beautiful enough to be universally desired, and they were rare enough to be safe repositories of value. They acted like coins in the era before coins were minted, and today the classical Chinese symbol for money even derives from a stylized drawing of one of these shells. Whether measured in gold or in cowries, by the year 1325, the wealth of the city of Gao had swollen it to such a degree that Mansa Musa, the richest man in the world and the emperor of Mali, desired to seize it. Musa soon ordered his armies to march against Gao and absorb it into his empire. In the preceding centuries, the wealth of Mali had turned it into a powerful military machine. If accounts are to be believed, Mali at this time had an army of 100,000 soldiers, including 10,000 horsemen.
I have an army that big. That's no big deal.
These were drawn from the aristocracy, just like European knights. Ironworking as a craft had been perfected in the Empire of Ghana, so that now whole clans of Mali's Mandinka people were given over to it, responsible for creating the spearheads, swords and arrows used by the imperial army. Mali's soldiers wore leather helmets and sometimes iron chainmail imported from Arabia. A certain proportion of this army were likely slave soldiers. Most would have been conscripted citizens, but many were also professional soldiers.
I mean, isn't conscription
And Mali's
slavery?
army also incorporated
Discuss.
specialist
Don't discuss.
fighters
Well, discuss if
from
you
the
want.
different territories that made up the empire. Oral historians recount the use of poison
Hi, Will.
gunmen
What's
from the
going on,
Santarani
baby?
River in the south, fire archers from Ouagadougou to the north, and heavy cavalry
Gah.
from the northern state
Yeah.
of Mema. Against this force, the small city-state of Gao would have had little chance. It was soon folded into the Empire of Mali, but by all accounts, Gao did quite well as a client state of this greater power. The Arab explorer Ibn Battuta visited Gao 28 years later, in 1353. In his writings, he is often quite scathing about Africa. He was scandalized by many of the customs of Mali's people and what he perceived to be the rudeness of their manners. For instance, at one point in his writings, he turns up his nose at the food offered to him by a local chief.
The The meal was served.
You're insulting
some
them
pounded millet
and
mixed with a little
embarrassing
honey and
me.
milk. This convinced me that there was no good to be hoped for from these people, and I made up my mind to travel back to Morocco at once.
Big Willie Scott
so I think
energy.
it's telling that when he
That's
saw
a
the
Indiana
walls,
Jones
the gates,
reference, by
and
the
the
way.
mosques of Gao, as well as the rich surplus of food kept in its storehouses, the sight seems to have impressed him greatly.
They've been doing great.
Then I travelled to the
Actually,
town
I'll
of
pull
Gao,
them up. We
which
got
is a great
one
town
from
on the Niger,
Voss,
one of the finest, biggest,
Cool Maid
and
Wolf.
most fertile cities of Africa.
and
There
we've
is
got a
much
little
rice
bit
there,
for
and milk, and chickens,
Stinky
and
Treen.
fish, and the cucumber, which
Yeah. And now we're working
While
on a
for
little
time,
gift
the
commission for our
Empire of
friend
Mali
Mix.
seemed
And I
invincible,
decided to get a little bit more
there were
loose with this
a
one and do
number
it just a
of
bunch of
great
cute little
weaknesses
sketches.
hiding just beneath its surface.
For, I guess we got another
And
20
all it took
minutes.
for those to
So I think we can
emerge
get one more
was for
pose
the great
after we
king
finish this one.
Mansa Musa to pass away. One of the greatest challenges any society faced up until very recently was that of royal succession. For most of history, countries have been ruled by kings. But when a king died, the question over who would rule his kingdom could become a lethal matter. If the king had an heir or named a successor, this person would have a strong claim. But he would need to command an overwhelming body of support from the lords and nobles and other stakeholders in the kingdom. But if a king died without an heir, then multiple challenges might present themselves. In the worst cases, the country would divide itself among the challengers, and this would lead to a war. If all the wars of succession in history are taken into account, we could probably find no greater waste of resources and time, let alone human life and suffering. Civil wars routinely brought countries to their knees, destroyed their industries, and decimated their populations. In many ways, they represented a greater danger than any plague, earthquake, or famine. And the people of this time lived in constant fear of them. In Europe, kings were terrified of dying without having produced a son. But in West Africa, the problem was usually not too few sons, but too many. West African kings usually had multiple wives, with 4 being allowed under medieval laws. So the chance of a king dying without an heir was much less than in Europe. According to the chronicles, one Songhai king named Askia Muhammad would have 37 sons during his reign, while the oral tradition places the number at closer to 500. And the problem wasn't only with sons fighting over the crown. Large families meant that any king usually had a great number of brothers, who may have fancied a hand at being king themselves. And with so many potential claimants to the throne, it would have been utterly essential to have clear and universally agreed upon laws about who should be king. And that's exactly what the kingdoms of West Africa didn't have.
Oop.
Those laws that did exist were elaborate and needlessly complicated. So when a king died, there were often multiple interpretations of who should take the throne. And this is something we'll see happen over and over throughout this episode. In times of peace, during the long reigns of its great kings, West Africa flourished. But the death of its kings virtually always led to disaster. In Mali, the great king Mansa Musa died in the year 1337, and the first to replace him was his son Magan. But Musa also had a brother, a man named Suleiman. Musa's son Magan ruled for only 4 years before his uncle struck, killing Magan and taking the throne for himself. Such an illegitimate act enraged the lords of the kingdom, and they each brought forth their contesting claims for the throne. What followed
You
was a
guys can't do
succession
that.
crisis that destroyed the unity of the empire. Suddenly, Mali's strong, united army splintered into factions, and it began to fight itself. Perhaps sensing weakness in the once great empire, horsemen from the land of Mossi to the south crossed the Niger River and began raiding around the city of Timbuktu. Racked by civil war, the Malians were unable to react, and the raids on their borders got bolder. Soon, the client states of the empire took notice. One of
Me
them
when I'm
was
bold,
the distant
naughty.
coastal kingdom of Jollof, which was the first to declare independence. When Mali failed to march on Jollof and restore it to the empire, other client states who wanted independence saw their chance. Mali had always been a single ethnicity project. While it ruled over a large variety of regions and tribes, its kings and social elite were all drawn from a people known as the Mande. They used the empire to project their power over the other groups, and this meant at the first sign of trouble, these other groups would seek to throw off the yoke of Mande rule.
The Monday.
Suleiman, the uncle
Got a
who
bad
had
case
killed
of
Mansa
the
Musa's
Mondays.
son, soon died
Sir, there is an
himself
invading army
and
on your
passed
doorstep.
the throne to his son. He was in turn overthrown by another, who was overthrown by another. During this crisis, the average king ruled for barely more than a few years, and the authority of the empire collapsed. Its client states broke free in droves, and one of these states was the
Oh, I
wealthy
could have
trade
connected this
city
one to the
of Gao.
toaster. Actually, you know what? It's not too late.
At this time,
And you know what?
the
We can
king
make
of
a little
Mali
sequential
was a
comic out
man
of that. That's
named
perfect.
Musa II,
Oh, I'm a genius.
but he was king
I actually have
in
like a huge
name
brain.
only. He had an advisor and counselor known as Mari Jata, who appears to have been the true power in the empire. At one point, Mari Jata even threw the young king in a jail cell to keep him out of the way. Because of this remarkable situation, and the decades of civil war and financial mismanagement, in places like Gao, the legitimacy of the Mali Empire must have been at an all-time low. Mali's eastern provinces were now in open rebellion, and it's at this point that the city of Gao declared independence. For the royal vizier Mari Jata, the loss of this great city, more than any other of his rebellious client states, must have been a huge blow. He must have been determined to crush this rebellion. He immediately dispatched
I have no
the
idea how
great
to draw a
Malian
smush
army
toaster.
to restore order in the east. And the army had some success. They recaptured Takeda, an important copper mining town in the north. But when they reached Gao, the newly formed kingdom of Songhai put up a much greater fight. By this time, Gao had
Yeah, that'll
seized
do.
large territories in the east, strengthening their power. They may have also gathered together other elements of the resistance against Mali, forming a kind of rebel alliance. They relied on guerrilla warfare, raiding Mali's urban centers, often using
looks like a
riverboats
dog.
on the Niger to deliver
Mark!
large amounts of troops
No!
right where they would be most effective, attacking swiftly and by surprise. These tactics allowed the kingdom of Songhai to tie up the larger but weakened army of Mali, and a sort of stalemate seems to have set in. But this war wouldn't end on the battlefield, but with the endless churn of royal murders that had swept the empire. The sickly king Musa II died in 1387. He may have still been imprisoned, and he may not have died naturally. Either way, the royal vizier Mari Jata refused to give up power. He killed Musa's brothers and ascended to the throne himself. He ruled for only a year before being assassinated.
Oh my god.
More provinces revolted. The Mossi people attacked the Mali Empire again, and soon invasion by the nomadic Tuareg people from the desert meant that Mali lost access to the northern trade routes across the Sahara. This meant it could no longer
Anyone else hear
import
Gianni
enough
screaming?
forces to supply its army, let alone fund its expensive wars. For the next century,
Nah, it's alright. We
Mali
only
would
have
be
like
locked
10
in
minutes
a
left
life or
anyway,
death
though.
struggle for its
Although-
very survival.
Useful.
In this period of chaos, the empire completely fell apart, and the rebellious
He's fine.
city of Gao was forgotten.
Yeah, don't listen too hard to whatever he's doing
The
out there.
kingdom of Songhai
It seems to be
was fully
screaming, which
established
is not,
by the 1430s.
you know.
The wheel of the
We all know
imperial
Gianni's gonna be
cycle
screaming.
turned.
I think he's doing a line reading or a
Out of all this
script reading.
chaos, the young kingdom of Songhai saw an opportunity to rise from the old empire's ashes. The next century saw the continuing decline of Mali and the rise of Songhai. And as the end of the 15th century drew near, this new kingdom was poised to become one of Africa's great powers. And one man, a ruthless and fearsome military leader, was about to take full advantage of the opportunity that this chaos had created. His name was Sunni Ali. Sunni Ali is perhaps the most controversial character in African history. We know little about his early life, who he was or where he came from. But what's clear is that he was a fierce military leader, a man of limitless energy and ambition. He took the throne of the Kingdom of Songhai in the year 1464, and his reign would mark an unprecedented expansion of this kingdom, so that it would soon extend further than the Empire of Mali ever had. But Sunni Ali is remembered very differently by the two sides of Songhai society. In the oral tradition of the griots, he is remembered as Ali Bear, or Ali the Great. In the stories of the griots, he is a great and wise man who commanded the powers of magic, the first ever emperor of the Songhai. But in the chronicles written by Muslim scholars, he is remembered as a cruel and tyrannical ruler. The chronicle Tarikh al-Fatash reserves particular condemnation for him.
He was extremely
tyrant,
yucky. We
the
hated
cursed,
him.
the oppressor,
Oh my god.
the Sunni Ali, a model of shameful conduct.
The model of shameful
true
conduct, holy
That
shit.
from virtually the moment he took power, Sunni Ali went to war. He was determined to modernize and reorganize his military. He had seen the Mali Empire collapse after its access to horses fell apart, and so he resolved to begin the large-scale breeding of horses in Africa. He built large stables to shelter these horses from the elements and from the disease-carrying tsetse fly. And he pioneered the use of crossbreeding to generate a
I
breed
didn't
of
realize
sturdy
horses could get infected
well
with sleeping
suited to
sickness.
the African environment. He also introduced the use of cavalry soldiers wearing iron breastplates beneath their tunics. These must have been difficult to wear in the African heat.
Oh, I could deal
but
with
he
it.
would have
I can handle
greatly
it.
increased the
That's how
weight
strong I
and
am.
strength of his cavalry.
I'm very beefy.
One of his great passions was also the use of a river navy. He expanded the raiding boats that the Songhai had used in their rebellion until the Songhai
I can handle the
commanded
sleeping sickness too.
a
Yep,
large
yeah.
fleet
I'm built
of
different.
400 boats that could transport troops up and down the
I
Niger
wonder
River
if horses
at
could get
rapid
the dancing
speeds.
plague.
He named one of his generals the admiral of this fleet, with the title Master of the Water.
Whoa.
He loved these
Wouldn't it be
boats
so
much
embarrassing if the Master
that
of
during
Water
one siege
drowned?
of the city of Jenne, lying many kilometers away from the river, Sunni Ali
That's
had
how
a
they
long
became the
canal
dancing
dug
queen.
so
Oh.
that his boats could continue supplying his men on the siege lines.
Hey, pasta. Rip
During
rib.
this time,
This is
the
so
Songhai
messed up.
abandoned guerrilla raids, instead taking on a more sustained and aggressive style of warfare. The chronicle Tarikh el-Sudan recalls the remarkable success that Sunni Ali enjoyed.
Ali was always victorious, pillaging every land on which he fixed his choice. Wherever he was present,
The Water
his
King
army
was drunk to
was
death. That's so true.
From Ganta
That was such a
to Sidi
fucked up
Ridoro,
episode.
His horses ran over
Gotta
all
rewatch
these
Futurama.
lands.
Part of the success of his campaign seems to have been his extreme ruthlessness, which we get some sense of through the Timbuktu Chronicles. From the Mongols to the Assyrians,
The deer that
military
does
leaders
Gangnam
throughout history
Style. That
have
sounds
used
horrifying.
terror as a weapon, and it can be an effective
excuse
military
me.
tactic.
Mm.
If your enemy are terrified of you, they may be more likely to run away and throw down their weapons, saving you time and resources in your conquests. Ali seems to have used this tactic to great effect.
Good for him. Or not. I don't know which way to fall on that. Alrighty. And you know what? I think that actually might just wrap up our commission stream today. We got a cute little thing from Mix. Oh, let me sign it. Memes channel, yes. I don't think I need to separate it. Well, maybe we'll just... We can do like a... impressionist sort of backgrounds here. Oh. Do right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's looking pretty alright for something I didn't plan. I swear to God, I better not be getting a cold. Maybe it's still a leftover from having the flu like 2 weeks ago. I still have like a little bit of like throat clearing stuff, but it better not be like a new illness. I've been slightly sniffing very quietly all day. I'll be pissed. I'll be pissed. I doubt it though. Other than that, I feel totally fine. It's cute. Alrighty. Totally fine. Well, I think I will call that a day. To all commissioners. Excuse me. Thank you so much. Oh my God, I need coffee. Thank you so much. Very productive. I'll be sending these along. Actually, I don't think I have any edits that I need to do. I think I actually kind of nailed all these today. If I do say so myself, but I will send them along shortly. As always, feel free to post it anywhere you like. I'll probably be putting them up on my Twitter too, maybe in a couple hours. But we will be here again, same place, same time tomorrow as well. Still seeing how the whole streaming every day thing works. So far it seems fine by me. I'm enjoying it. Getting some work done nice and fast. Yeah. I'll probably be resetting the Google Doc or the Google submission form sometime later this evening. I'll post about it on Twitter. So if you're looking for a commission on Twitter at mkdalma6, you will be able to find it. Yep. That's it, suckers. Nice seeing y'all. Everybody be good. Have a good dinner. Have a good sleep. Have a good whatever. And I will catch you tomorrow.